She was 101 years old when she died, and the tributes ran for days. The horse racing, the gin and dubonnet before lunch, the hats, the wave from the carriage, the specific warmth of a woman whose public persona had been so thoroughly constructed around the qualities of benign grandmotherly delight that the construction had long since replaced the person in the public imagination, leaving behind a brand so complete and so durable that the person inside it had become, for most of the people who consumed the brand across the decades of its production, essentially inaccessible behind it. The brand was the most successful personal management operation in 20th century British public life, more successful than Churchill's, more durable than Diana's, more completely organized around the gap between the public account and the private reality than any comparable figure in the relevant era, because the gap in the Queen Mother's case was managed with such consistency and such professional sophistication across 100 years of the relevant world's observation that the management itself became invisible. The gap was not visible as a gap because the public account was so thoroughly produced that the alternative account had no available surface to attach itself to. The centerpiece of the brand was the marriage. George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the devoted couple, the wartime steadiness, the specific image of two people who had been given the crown they had not sought and who had carried it together with the particular combination of duty and genuine partnership that the relevant world organized the public account of the marriage around, across the full span of the reign, and the subsequent 50 years of the widowhood's management of the marriage's legacy. The image was not false in all its dimensions. George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon were genuinely committed to the institutional role the abdication had placed on both of them. The wartime conduct was genuinely brave in certain of its specific dimensions. The marriage lasted until George VI's death in February 1952, 28 years after the wedding, and its lasting was the lasting of something that had enough genuine content to sustain itself across 28 years of the relevant pressures. But the marriage was darker than the brand allowed, considerably darker, in the specific ways that the honest examination of the available evidence produces when the examination is organized around the evidence rather than around the brand's preferred account of the relevant subject. George VI was a man of genuine personal difficulty, whose specific difficulties the brand's management organized around the heroic narrative of someone who had overcome his limitations in service of the institutional duty, rather than around the honest account of what those difficulties actually were and what they cost the people closest to him. He was damaged in specific ways that the relevant formation and the relevant circumstances had produced, and the damage was real, and it shaped the marriage in specific ways that the honest account requires to be examined rather than managed into the background of the devoted couple narrative. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a woman of formidable intelligence and formidable social capability, whose specific qualities included the qualities the brand celebrated and the qualities the brand was organized around not celebrating, the specific ambition that the relevant formation had produced in her, alongside the warmth, the particular ruthlessness of someone whose social intelligence was deployed consistently in service of clearly understood priorities, the specific management of the relevant relationships and the relevant public accounts with the professional consistency of someone for whom the management of the preferred account was the primary organizational principle of every significant decision. The marriage between those two people was the marriage whose honest account this script assembles from the available evidence. The honest account is more complicated than the brand. It is also more interesting because the honest account of two genuinely complicated people in a genuinely complicated institutional marriage across 28 years of the most demanding available circumstances is always more interesting than the brand that the management of the public account was organized around producing in place of the honest account. The brand lasted 100 years. The honest account has been waiting. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4, 1900, at St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire, the ninth of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, who became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn in 1904, and Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, whose family connections placed the Bowes-Lyon family in the specific social world that sat at the intersection of the Scottish aristocracy and the English upper class, in its Edwardian configuration. The family she was born into was the family of the Scottish landed aristocracy in its specific late Victorian and Edwardian form, substantial, well-connected, possessed of the castles and the estates, and the specific combination of social confidence and financial comfort that the relevant formation produced in its members across the generations of the relevant world's self-reproduction. Glamis Castle in Angus, the family's primary Scottish seat, was the physical expression of the world Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon grew up in. Ancient, imposing, organized around the specific rhythms of the Scottish aristocratic year that the relevant world had developed across the centuries of its existence, and that the Edwardian period maintained in the specific form of shooting seasons and house parties, and the particular social calendar that the relevant class organized its year around. The world she grew up in was a world of considerable privilege, whose specific character shaped her in the specific ways that worlds of considerable privilege shape the people who grow up within them when the relevant formation is operating in its most complete and most consistent form. The privilege was real, and its specific character was the character of a world that organized itself around the assumption that the relevant resources and the relevant social connections were the natural conditions of existence rather than the specific historical product of specific historical circumstances, and that the assumption was the assumption that the formation produced in the people it shaped as the ambient understanding of their world, rather than as the explicit belief whose examination the formation was organized around preventing. She was the 9th child. The position in the family's birth order was a position whose specific character gave her a formation that the eldest child's formation did not produce, and that the youngest child's formation did not produce, but that the 9th child's position in a large family, with the specific social world the Bowes-Lyon family inhabited, produced in someone whose natural capabilities were sufficient to take advantage of what the position offered. The 9th child in a large aristocratic family has a specific freedom that the elder children's more heavily managed formation does not provide. The freedom of someone whose position in the family's institutional hierarchy is sufficiently established to provide security and sufficiently removed from the most acute demands of the relevant institutional expectations to allow the development of the specific personal capabilities that the freedom produces in people whose natural capabilities are sufficient to develop them. Elizabeth's natural capabilities were considerable. The accounts of people who knew her in the childhood and the young adult years are consistent in identifying the same cluster of qualities that the subsequent decades would demonstrate as the consistent features of her adult character: the social intelligence, the physical warmth, the specific quality of engaged attention to the person in front of her that the relevant accounts identify as the most immediately striking quality of her personal engagement with the people in her world, the particular humor that the relevant social world valued most in the register that she deployed it in, and the specific additional quality that the accounts of people who knew her most closely across her adult life identify as the quality beneath the warmth, whose presence the warmth was organized around making invisible. The quality beneath the warmth was the specific ambition, not the crude ambition of someone who had identified a goal and was pursuing it through the direct application of available means toward the identified goal's achievement, but the more sophisticated ambition of someone whose intelligence and whose social capability had produced a clear understanding of the relevant world and its specific organization of the available positions within it, and whose management of her own position within the relevant world was organized around the clear understanding of what the available positions were and how the available means might be deployed toward the occupation of the most significant available position. The most significant available position in the relevant world of the early 1920s for a woman of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's specific background and specific capabilities was not the position of a working woman pursuing a professional career, because the relevant world of the early 1920s did not organize the most significant available positions around the professional careers of women of the relevant background. The most significant available position for someone of her specific formation in the relevant world was the position that the relevant marriage could produce, and the relevant marriage whose production would place her in the most significant available position was the marriage into the royal family, whose social world she had been moving in the relevant social circles adjacent to, across the years of her young adult formation. She had known the Duke of York, Prince Albert, since at least 1920, and by some accounts, since earlier in the relevant social circuit's organization of the occasions where both were present. The knowing was the knowing of the relevant social world's occasions, the house parties, the London season events, the specific social calendar that the relevant aristocratic world organized around itself, and that placed people of the relevant backgrounds in the same social settings with sufficient regularity to produce the sustained contact that the development of significant relationships required. Prince Albert had been interested in her across multiple years of the relevant contact before the marriage was concluded. The specific timeline of the courtship is documented in the relevant biographical accounts, with the consistency of sources whose independent examination of the available evidence produces the same picture of a courtship whose specific character reflected the specific qualities of both principal parties to it. Albert was genuinely attracted to Elizabeth. The attraction was the attraction of someone who had found in a specific person the combination of qualities that the relevant formation had produced, and that the relevant formation in his specific case had consistently denied him access to, in the conditions of the institutional world he had grown up in. What Albert had been consistently denied was the specific quality of warmth and social ease, and the genuine engaged attention to the person in front of him that Elizabeth provided, with the specific naturalness of someone for whom the provision of these qualities was the natural expression of the formed character, rather than the managed performance of qualities, whose natural expression required the sustained effort of someone performing against natural alternative inclinations. Albert was not a socially easy man. His stammer, which had been present since childhood, and which the relevant formation had been organized around managing rather than addressing, in the specific medical terms that the subsequent decades would develop for the management of the relevant condition, produced in him the specific combination of the anxiety about public performance and the particular withdrawal into the private world that sustained anxiety about public performance reliably produces in the people who experience it across the years of the relevant formation. He was warm in the conditions where the anxiety about public performance was most reduced, and he was difficult in the conditions where the anxiety was most present, which was the conditions of the public occasions that his institutional position organized a significant proportion of his time around. Elizabeth's warmth and social ease in exactly the conditions where Albert's anxiety was most acute was the specific combination that the attraction reflected, and the specific quality of what Elizabeth provided in those conditions was the provision of the specific relief from the anxiety's acute form that the warmth and the social ease of the person beside him produced in the specific conditions of the public occasions where the anxiety was most acutely present. She turned down his proposal twice before accepting it in 1923. The two refusals have been the subject of various accounts whose specific assessments of the refusal's character reflect the specific perspective the relevant account is organized around producing. The sympathetic account of the refusals presents them as the genuine hesitation of someone uncertain about whether the institutional life was the life she wanted, and whose acceptance of the proposal was therefore the genuine conclusion of a genuine uncertainty's resolution. The honest account of the refusals requires holding the sympathetic account's genuine dimensions alongside the specific additional dimensions that the honest examination of the available evidence produces when the examination is organized around Elizabeth's specific character rather than around the brand's preferred account of the relevant subject. The specific additional dimensions are the dimensions of the strategic management of the relevant circumstances that the social intelligence and the specific ambition whose operation the brand was organized around making invisible would have produced in someone of Elizabeth's specific capabilities in the specific conditions of the relevant courtship. The strategic management of a significant courtship by someone whose social intelligence was as developed as Elizabeth's and whose understanding of the relevant world's organization around the available positions was as clear as the subsequent decades of her conduct demonstrate it to have been, would have produced the specific management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the optimal available outcome. The optimal available outcome was the marriage whose conclusion the 1923 acceptance produced. The specific timing of the acceptance, after two refusals, in conditions where the Duke of York's persistence had demonstrated the specific quality of his commitment to the conclusion the acceptance would produce, was the timing that the strategic management of the relevant circumstances would have identified as the optimal moment for the acceptance's delivery, in conditions where the persistence had established the commitment's specific quality and where the acceptance's delivery at the optimal moment would produce the specific outcome that the optimal management of the relevant circumstances was organized around achieving. The outcome was the marriage to the king's second son. In 1923, when the marriage was concluded, the king's second son was the second son, and the specific position of the second son's wife in the relevant world was the position of a significant royal marriage without the most acute demands of the direct heir's position. The position was significant. The demands were manageable. The specific combination of significance and manageability was the combination that someone of Elizabeth's specific intelligence and specific ambition, operating in the relevant world's conditions of 1923, would have identified as the optimal available outcome. The abdication of 1936 transformed the outcome into something considerably more significant and considerably more demanding than the 1923 marriage's position in the relevant world had appeared to offer. The transformation is the subject of Part 4 of this account. What requires examination here is the specific character of the woman whose intelligence and ambition had managed the 1923 marriage's conclusion, because the character that managed the conclusion in 1923 was the character that managed the subsequent decades of the institutional life and the widowhood in the specific ways that this account examines across its subsequent sections. The character was the character of formidable intelligence operating in the service of clearly understood priorities, expressed in the specific register of the warmth and the social ease, and the genuine engaged attention to the person in front of her that the brand's public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was. The warmth was real. The intelligence was also real. The priorities the intelligence served were the priorities that the honest account requires to be placed alongside the warmth in the honest portrait, rather than managed into the background of the warmth's celebration. The brand celebrated the warmth. The honest account requires the intelligence and the priorities alongside it. The intelligence shaped the marriage from its beginning. The priorities organized the marriage's management across its duration. Both the intelligence and the priorities were Elizabeth's, expressed in the specific conditions of the relevant world across the full span of the relevant period, with the consistency of a formed character whose primary organizational principle was the management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the clearly understood priorities. The marriage was the primary context of the management's operation across the most significant decades of the relevant period. The marriage was darker than the management's preferred account allowed. The darkness is what the honest examination of the available evidence produces when the examination is organized around the evidence rather than around the management's preferred account. The evidence is assembled here. The wedding took place on April 26, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 22 years old. Prince Albert, Duke of York, was 27. The ceremony was the first royal wedding at Westminster Abbey since 1383, which gave it the specific historical significance that the relevant institutional management of the public account organized the coverage around. And the coverage was the coverage of an occasion that the relevant era's press organized around the warm, romantic narrative of a love match between a prince and a commoner, the specific fairy tale framing that the relevant world deployed for royal marriages whose participants met the relevant criteria for the fairy tale's requirements. The fairy tale framing was the framing that the brand's subsequent management of the marriage's public account would sustain and develop across the subsequent decades of the marriage's duration and the 50 years of the widowhood's management of the marriage's legacy. The framing was organized around the specific qualities of the marriage that the fairy tale required: the love, the devotion, the particular warmth of two people who had found in each other the specific thing the relevant narrative required them to have found, expressed in the specific public occasions, and the specific public account of the private reality that the relevant institutional management produced across the full span of the relevant period. The fairy tale had genuine content. The attraction was real, in the sense that Albert's attraction to Elizabeth was the genuine attraction of someone who had found in a specific person the specific combination of qualities that the relevant formation had consistently denied him access to in the conditions of the institutional world he had grown up in. The warmth was real. The specific quality of Elizabeth's engagement with Albert in the conditions of his most acute anxiety was the real engagement of someone whose social capability was genuine and whose deployment of that capability in the specific conditions of Albert's anxiety produced the specific relief from the anxiety's acute form that the relevant accounts of people who observed them together in the early years of the marriage consistently describe. The genuine content was the genuine content of two people whose specific qualities were complementary in the specific ways that the relevant accounts document. Albert's need for the specific warmth and social ease that Elizabeth provided was genuine, and its specific quality was the quality of someone whose formation had produced the anxiety and the withdrawal that the stammer and the institutional demands of his position had generated across the years of his development, and whose experience of Elizabeth's specific provision of the warmth and the social ease in the conditions of the anxiety's most acute presence was the experience of someone receiving what the relevant formation had consistently denied him. Elizabeth's provision of the relevant qualities was genuine in the sense that the warmth and the social ease were the genuine expression of the formed character, rather than the performed expression of qualities, deployed strategically in the specific conditions of the relevant courtship for the specific purposes of the relevant management. The genuineness of the expression was the genuineness of someone whose natural capabilities were the capabilities the expression reflected, deployed in the conditions of the relevant relationship with the natural ease of someone whose formation had produced the relevant capabilities as the natural expression of the character, rather than as the managed performance of a character whose natural inclinations were different. The genuine content was real. The honest account of the marriage's beginning requires acknowledging the genuine content alongside the honest account of the specific additional dimensions that the honest examination of the available evidence produces when the examination is organized around the full picture of the marriage's beginning, rather than around the fairy tale framing's selection of the dimensions the fairy tale required. The specific additional dimensions are the dimensions of the power dynamic that the marriage's structure established from its beginning, and that the subsequent decades of the marriage's development expressed with the consistency of something built into the structure rather than produced by the specific events of the relevant period. The power dynamic was the power dynamic of a marriage between two people whose specific capabilities and specific formations had produced a fundamental asymmetry in the distribution of the relevant capabilities across the marriage's primary demands. Albert was the institutional authority, the king's son, the Duke of York, the person whose constitutional position organized the marriage's institutional dimensions around his position rather than around hers. Elizabeth was the socially capable one, the person whose formation had produced the specific combination of social intelligence and warmth, and the particular capability for the management of the relevant social occasions that the institutional demands of the relevant position required. The asymmetry produced the specific dynamic of a marriage in which the institutional authority and the social capability were distributed between the two parties in ways that made the marriage's actual functional operation depend on Elizabeth's specific capabilities in the specific conditions where those capabilities were most required, while the institutional authority's formal organization around Albert's position produced the public account of the marriage as the devoted partnership of two people whose mutual support and mutual devotion organized the relevant shared life around the equal partnership that the fairy tale narrative required. The equal partnership was not the actual functional organization of the marriage. The actual functional organization was the organization of a marriage in which Elizabeth's specific capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the institutional demands in the conditions where those demands were most acute, organized around Albert's institutional position and its requirements, rather than around the equal partnership that the public account was organized around presenting. The specific conditions where Elizabeth's capabilities were most required were the conditions of the public occasions, the specific social events, and the official engagements and the institutional occasions that the relevant position organized around the relevant requirements, in which Albert's stammer and the anxiety the stammer produced in the conditions of the public performance were the specific difficulties that Elizabeth's social ease and warmth were the specific resources for managing. The management was genuine, in the sense that Elizabeth genuinely managed the relevant difficulties with the specific capabilities her formation had produced in her, and the management was effective in the specific sense of producing the public account of the relevant occasions that the institutional management of the relevant position required. The effectiveness was real, and its specific quality was the quality of someone whose social capability was the genuine expression of the formed character, rather than the managed performance of capabilities whose natural expression required sustained effort. The management was also, and the honest account of the marriage's structure requires this acknowledgement alongside the acknowledgement of the management's genuine dimensions, the management of someone whose specific capabilities gave her the specific leverage within the marriage's functional organization that the management's requirement produced. The leverage was the leverage of the person whose capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the most acute institutional demands, in conditions where the person whose position organized the institutional demands around his authority was the person most dependent on the other person's capabilities for the management of those demands. The dependency was real, and the leverage it produced was real, and the honest account of the marriage's power dynamic requires acknowledging both the institutional authority's formal organization around Albert's position and the functional leverage that Elizabeth's specific capabilities gave her in the conditions of the management's requirement, rather than organizing the account around either dimension in isolation from the other. The specific quality of the leverage's expression in the daily texture of the marriage's private life is the dimension of the marriage's power dynamic, whose honest examination the available evidence most directly supports, while simultaneously being the dimension whose honest examination the official account has always been most organized around preventing from becoming the public account of the relevant subject. The prevention was organized around the fairy tale framing's production and sustaining, the consistent management of the public account of the marriage around the devoted couple narrative, and the particular warmth of two people whose mutual devotion organized the relevant shared life, which was the public account that the relevant institutional management had always been organized around producing, and that the brand's subsequent management of the marriage's legacy sustained across the 50 years of the widowhood. The people who knew the marriage most directly, the household staff, the people in the immediate social world of the relevant position, the specific individuals whose proximity to the private dimensions of the marriage's daily texture gave them the accurate knowledge of the marriage's functional organization, rather than simply the public account's version of it, described the marriage in terms that the relevant biographies of the period have addressed with varying degrees of directness. Sarah Bradford's biography of George VI, published in 1989, is among the most directly honest of the relevant biographical accounts in its examination of the specific power dynamic that the marriage's functional organization produced. Her account draws on sources whose proximity to the relevant private dimensions of the marriage gives their accounts the specific authority of people who had observed the marriage in the conditions of its actual functional organization, rather than in the conditions of the public account's presentation. Bradford's account describes the specific quality of Elizabeth's management of the marriage's functional organization with the honesty of someone whose examination of the relevant sources had produced the picture of the marriage that the honest examination of the available evidence supports, rather than the picture the brand's preferred account had always been organized around producing. The picture is the picture of a marriage in which Elizabeth's specific capabilities were the primary functional resource for the management of the most acute institutional demands, organized around the specific dependency that the capabilities requirement in the conditions of those demands produced in the person whose institutional authority organized the marriage's formal structure around his position. Peter Townsend, who served as equerry to George VI from 1944, and whose proximity to the private dimensions of the royal household across the relevant years gave him the specific observational access to the marriage's private texture that the equerry role produced, described the marriage in time and chance with the specific directness of someone whose account was organized around the honest examination of what he had observed, rather than around the institutional management of the preferred account. His description of the specific quality of Elizabeth's presence in the household and the specific quality of her management of the relevant occasions and relationships is the description of someone who had observed the management's operation directly and who understood, through the observation, the specific quality of the capabilities whose operation the management reflected. The description is the description of formidable social intelligence operating in the service of clearly understood priorities, expressed in the specific register of the warmth and the engaged attention that the brand's public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was. The brand organized itself around the warmth. The honest examination requires the intelligence and the priorities alongside the warmth. The intelligence shaped the marriage's functional organization from its beginning. The priorities organized the management of the functional organization's operation across the relevant decades. The specific quality of the power dynamic that the functional organization produced was the quality that the honest account of the marriage's beginning requires to be named in the direct terms that the honest naming demands, rather than managed into the background of the devoted couple narrative that the brand's preferred account was organized around sustaining. The power dynamic was the dynamic of a marriage in which the institutional authority and the social capability were distributed across the two parties in the specific asymmetric form that the relevant capabilities and the relevant formation had produced, generating the specific leverage and the specific dependency that the asymmetric distribution reliably generates in the marriages it characterizes. Albert was dependent on Elizabeth's capabilities in the conditions where the capabilities were most required. The dependency was the dependency that the stammer and the anxiety and the specific quality of his formation had produced in him, in the conditions of the institutional demands that his position organized around his authority. The dependency gave Elizabeth the specific leverage within the marriage's functional organization that the dependency's requirement produced. The leverage was Elizabeth's primary instrument across the marriage's duration. The instrument was genuine in the sense of being the natural expression of the formed character's capabilities, rather than the deliberate deployment of a calculated strategy. The genuineness did not reduce the instrument's specific effectiveness or the specific quality of its operation in the conditions of the marriage's daily life. The marriage's beginning established the instrument and its specific character. The subsequent decades of the marriage's development expressed the instrument's operation in the specific conditions of the relevant circumstances, including the abdication and the wartime years, and the specific quality of the reign's management across the period between 1936 and 1952. The instrument's operation is the subject of the subsequent sections of this account. What Part 2 has established is the specific character of the marriage's beginning, the genuine content alongside the honest account of the power dynamic that the marriage's structure established and that the subsequent decades expressed with the consistency of something built into the structure rather than produced by the specific events of the relevant period. The fairy tale had genuine content. The fairy tale was also the management of a more complicated reality, whose honest account the brand was organized around preventing from becoming the dominant public account of the relevant subject. The honest account is assembled here from the available evidence. The available evidence is the evidence whose examination produces the picture of a marriage considerably darker than the brand allowed. The darkness is what the honest account requires to be named. The naming begins here and continues across the subsequent sections of this account. The stammer was present from early childhood. Albert Frederick Arthur George, second son of George V and Queen Mary, was speaking with the specific disfluency that the relevant medical understanding of the era categorized as stammering by the time he was old enough for the speech difficulty to be visible in the conditions of the relevant occasions, and the relevant occasions in the specific world of the British royal family in the early years of the 20th century were occasions that made the speech difficulty's visibility both more acute and more consequential than it would have been in the conditions of a less institutionally demanding childhood formation. George V was not a gentle father. The accounts of his parenting across the relevant biographical record are consistent in describing someone whose specific approach to the formation of his children was organized around the standards and the expectations of a naval officer whose professional formation had produced the specific combination of physical toughness and emotional restraint that the relevant formation reliably produced in the men it shaped. applied to the domestic context of the royal family's child-rearing, with the specific demands and the specific limited tolerance for the difficulties that the demands produced in the children they were applied to. The stammer was a difficulty that the relevant parental approach was not organized around accommodating with the specific patients and the specific alternative approach that the accommodation of a speech difficulty in the conditions of a demanding child-rearing environment requires. George V found the stammer difficult to manage in the specific conditions of his relationship with Albert, not in the explicitly cruel sense of deliberate mockery or active punishment of the difficulty, but in the subtler and in certain respects more damaging sense of someone whose formation had not produced the specific capability for the patient accommodation of difficulty in the people around him, and who therefore managed the stammer in the specific ways that the absence of that capability reliably produced. The management produced in Albert the specific psychological texture that the sustained experience of a significant personal difficulty in the conditions of an environment that is not organized around its patient accommodation reliably produces in the people who experience it, the anxiety, the withdrawal into the conditions where the difficulty is least likely to be required and most likely to be managed, into the background of the relevant interaction, and the specific combination of the acute awareness of the difficulty's presence in the conditions of its most visible expression and the equally acute awareness of the relevant environment's response to the visible expression. Albert's stammer was the most publicly documented personal difficulty of his life, and the specific way it was publicly documented across the relevant decades reflects the specific management of the public account of the relevant subject, that the institutional management of the relevant position's presentation, organized around the stammer's public dimensions. The management produced the heroic narrative, the man who had overcome his stammer in the service of the institutional duty, expressed most completely in the wartime broadcasts, whose specific quality of managed delivery the relevant public received as the evidence of the courage the relevant narrative required. Lionel Logue was the Australian speech therapist whose specific professional engagement with Albert's stammer from 1926 onward produced the particular improvement in the management of the stammer's most visible dimensions that the relevant accounts of the period consistently document. The Logue engagement was the most significant single professional intervention in the management of the stammer across the relevant period, and its specific character, the sustained professional relationship between Logue and Albert across the years of the relevant work, is documented in Logue's diary, published posthumously by his grandson Mark Logue in 2010, with the specific detail that the primary source material provides. The diary's account of the specific quality of the work between Logue and Albert is the account of a professional relationship organized around the specific techniques that Logue had developed for the management of the relevant speech difficulty and whose application to Albert's specific form of the difficulty produced the specific improvement that the relevant accounts document. The improvement was real. The management of the stammer through the Logue techniques was the management of something whose most acute visible dimensions were reduced through the specific application of the relevant professional capability, without the fundamental resolution of the underlying condition that the specific techniques were managing the visible dimensions of, rather than addressing in the terms of the fundamental resolution. The fundamental condition remained. What the Logue engagement produced was the specific management of the most visible dimensions of the condition in the conditions of the most demanding occasions, not the elimination of the condition whose presence in the less managed conditions of the daily life was the presence that shaped the marriage's private texture in the specific ways that the honest account of the marriage's private dimensions requires to be examined. The marriage's private texture in the conditions of the stammer's presence was the texture that Elizabeth's management of the relevant occasions in the conditions of the stammer's acute visibility had always been organized around addressing, and the specific quality of the texture was the texture of a shared life in which one party's most significant personal difficulty was the consistent background of the other party's primary social activity. The management of the institutional occasions and the relevant social relationships in the conditions of the difficulty's consistent presence as the organizing challenge of the relevant management's requirements. The management was Elizabeth's primary contribution to the marriage's functional organization, and the specific quality of the contribution was the quality of someone whose social capability was the specific resource for the management of the institutional occasions in conditions where the institutional authority, whose position organized the occasions around his authority, was the person most dependent on the management for the successful navigation of the occasion's requirements. The dependency shaped the marriage in specific ways, whose honest examination the available evidence supports across the full span of the relevant biographical record. It shaped the dynamic of who deferred to whom in the conditions of the relevant decisions. The specific quality of the decision-making process within the marriage was the process of someone whose social capability and whose management of the relevant occasions gave her the specific weight in the relevant decisions that the management's requirement produced, alongside the institutional authority's formal organization of the relevant position around his authority. It shaped the specific quality of the private relationship's texture in the conditions of the daily life, the specific quality of being married to someone whose most significant personal difficulty was the consistent organizing challenge of the shared life's most demanding occasions, was the quality of a shared life in which the person whose capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the difficulty was consistently required to deploy those capabilities in service of the management rather than in service of the full range of the personal relationship's requirements. The full range of the personal relationship's requirements was the range that includes the specific dimensions of intimate partnership that the management's consistent demand reduced in the conditions of the marriage's daily life. The reduction was not the reduction of someone whose capabilities were absent or undeveloped in the relevant dimensions. It was the reduction of someone whose capabilities were consistently required for the management of the institutional demands in ways that left the personal relationship's other dimensions consistently in the position of receiving what remained after the management's requirements had been met, rather than receiving the full attention that the personal relationship's dimensions independently required. The honest accounts of the marriage's private texture, from people whose proximity to the relevant dimensions gave them the observational access to what the marriage actually was, rather than what the public account was organized around presenting it as being, are accounts that reflect the specific quality of this reduction in the specific ways that the reduction's operation in the conditions of the relevant daily life produced. Marion Crawford, who served as governess to Elizabeth and Margaret from 1933, and whose proximity to the household across the relevant years gave her the specific observational access to the marriage's private dimensions that the governess role in the royal household produced, described the marriage in The Little Princesses with the specific directness of someone whose account was organized around the honest examination of what she had observed, rather than around the institutional management of the preferred account. Crawford's account describes the specific quality of George VI's presence in the household in terms that reflect the honest examination of the daily texture she had observed, the specific quality of a man whose anxieties were real and whose management of those anxieties in the conditions of the household's daily life was the management of someone whose formation had not produced the specific emotional availability that the full dimensions of the domestic life required, alongside the management of the institutional demands. The emotional availability was the dimension of the marriage's private texture, whose reduction, the stammer, and its management, most directly produced in the conditions of the daily life. The stammer's management required the sustained deployment of the anxiety management's specific techniques in the conditions of the public occasions, which was the deployment that the Logue engagement had made more effective in the specific conditions of the most demanding occasions, but that remained the consistent organizing challenge of the daily life's less managed conditions, rather than being reduced to the occasional challenge of the specific occasions. The consistent organizing challenge of the daily life's less managed conditions was the challenge that the marriage's private texture was organized around, and the organization of the private texture around the consistent challenge produced the specific quality of a shared life in which the management's demands were the consistent background of the daily life, rather than the specific occasional demands of the institutional occasions. Elizabeth's management of the consistent background was the management of someone whose social capability was the specific resource for the relevant management, and whose deployment of that resource, in the conditions of the consistent challenge, was the consistent deployment, rather than the occasional deployment that the institutional occasions alone would have required. The consistent deployment was the specific cost that the marriage's private texture imposed on Elizabeth in the conditions of the relevant management's requirements. The cost was real. The honest account of the marriage requires acknowledging the cost, alongside the honest account of the genuine dimensions of the marriage's content, because the cost was the specific dimension of the marriage's private texture, whose honest examination, the brand's management of the public account, was most consistently organized around preventing from becoming the available account of the relevant subject. The brand prevented the examination across the full span of the management's operation. The examination is produced here from the available evidence whose honest assessment produces the picture of the marriage's private texture that the brand's management was organized around preventing. The picture includes the stammer and what it cost both of them. Albert paid the cost of the stammer's consistent presence in the conditions of the institutional demands, the anxiety, the specific quality of someone whose most significant personal difficulty was the consistent organizing challenge of the most demanding occasions of the institutional life he was required to inhabit. Elizabeth paid the cost of the management's consistent requirement, the sustained deployment of the specific capabilities whose management of the stammer's most acute dimensions in the conditions of the relevant occasions was the primary functional resource of the marriage's management of the institutional demands. Both costs were real. Both shaped the marriage in the specific ways the honest account requires to be examined. The examination produces the picture of a marriage whose private texture was considerably more demanding and considerably more complicated than the devoted couple narrative the brand organized itself around, presenting as the marriage's primary available account. The demanding and the complicated were the marriage's private reality. The devoted couple narrative was the brand's public account. Both were real in their respective dimensions. The honest account holds both, rather than organizing itself around either in isolation from the other. The stammer was the organizing fact of the marriage's most significant private difficulty. The difficulty shaped the marriage's power dynamic, and the marriage's functional organization, and the marriage's private texture across the full span of the relevant period. The shaping was the shaping of a significant personal difficulty's consistent presence in the conditions of a shared life, organized around the management of the institutional demands that the relevant position imposed on both parties to the marriage. The management was Elizabeth's primary contribution. The difficulty was Albert's primary burden. Both the contribution and the burden were real, and their simultaneous reality in the conditions of the marriage's daily texture was the specific quality of the private reality that the brand's public account was organized around, not presenting as the available account of the relevant subject. The brand presented the devoted couple. The honest account presents the management and the burden alongside the genuine dimensions, whose reality, the devoted couple narrative, had genuine content to organize itself around. The genuine content was real. The management and the burden were also real. Both required the other for the honest account of the marriage's private texture to be the honest account, rather than the partial account that either in isolation from the other produces. Edward VI abdicated on December 11, 1936. The abdication statement was read at Fort Belvedere and broadcast across the relevant communications networks to the specific audiences whose reception of the statement was the reception of people who had been following the constitutional crisis across the preceding weeks, with the specific combination of fascination and alarm that the relevant public account of the crisis had organized the public's engagement around. Edward was leaving. Wallace Simpson was the reason. The throne was passing to Albert, Duke of York, who became George VI on the day of his brother's abdication, and who received the crown in the specific conditions of someone who had not been prepared for it, and who understood, with the specific clarity of someone in full possession of the relevant facts about his own situation, exactly what the receiving of the crown in those conditions was going to require of him. The requiring was going to be considerable. George VI at 40 was a man whose specific formation across the years of the second son's position had produced the specific capabilities and the specific limitations that the second son's formation reliably produces in the person it shapes. The capabilities were the capabilities of someone who had developed the specific qualities that the second son's position in the relevant world gave the relevant formation the room to develop. The genuine personal warmth in the private conditions where the anxiety about public performance was most reduced, the specific commitment to the people and the duties he had accepted as his own, the particular quality of someone whose formation had organized itself around the demands of the supporting role, rather than around the demands of the primary role, whose preparation the heir's formation was organized around. The limitations were the limitations of the specific preparation the formation had not provided. The second son's formation was not organized around the constitutional preparation that the direct heir's formation was organized around. The specific dimensions of the constitutional role, the relationship with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the management of the constitutional machinery in the conditions of the relevant occasions, the particular quality of the public performance's demands in the specific conditions of the most significant constitutional occasions, were dimensions that George VI's formation had not prepared him for, in the specific terms that the heir's formation produced for the person it was organized around preparing. The abdication placed the unprepared man in the constitutional role, whose preparation the formation had not provided, in the specific conditions of a constitutional crisis, whose acute phase had been resolved by the abdication itself, but whose management of the relevant aftermath required the immediate and sustained deployment of the capabilities that the preparation had not produced, organized around the institutional demands of a role whose requirements the relevant formation had never been organized around meeting. Elizabeth's response to the abdication was the response that the available accounts of the relevant period most consistently describe in terms that reflect the specific character of the woman this account has been examining across the preceding sections. The response was not the response of someone who received the abdication and its implications with the specific combination of reluctance and resignation that the sympathetic account of the relevant event has always organized its presentation of Elizabeth's response around. The response was the response of someone whose social intelligence and whose understanding of the relevant world's organization around the available positions gave her the specific capability for the accurate assessment of what the abdication's implications were, and what the accurate assessment of those implications required of someone in her specific position. The accurate assessment was the assessment of someone who understood that the abdication had transformed the marriage's institutional dimensions from the dimensions of the second son's wife's position into the dimensions of the queen consort's position, which was the most significant available institutional position for someone of her specific background and specific capabilities in the relevant world. The transformation was the transformation that the 1923 marriage's conclusion had not been organized around producing in the conditions of the original marriage's institutional dimensions, and that the abdication had produced in the specific conditions of the constitutional crisis, whose resolution had placed Albert on the throne. The transformation was unwelcome in the specific sense that the institutional demands it imposed on both parties to the marriage were considerably more acute than the demands of the second son's position had been, and the specific quality of the unwelcome was genuine in the sense that both Elizabeth and Albert understood what the transformation's demands were going to require of each of them in the conditions of the relevant institutional life. George VI's response to the abdication's implications for his own position was documented across the relevant biographical accounts, in terms that reflect the specific combination of the genuine commitment to the institutional duty and the specific anxiety about the demands the duty would impose in the conditions of his specific capabilities and limitations. He wept when the abdication became certain. The weeping was the weeping of someone who understood what the relevant circumstances were going to require of him, and who was genuinely uncertain about whether the relevant capabilities were sufficient for the requirements. The uncertainty was genuine, and the honest account of the abdication's impact on George VI requires acknowledging the uncertainty's genuineness alongside the honest account of how the uncertainty was managed across the subsequent years of the reign. The management of the uncertainty was organized around the specific resources that the marriage's functional organization had always organized the management of the relevant challenges around. Elizabeth's social capability and the specific quality of her management of the institutional demands in the conditions of the relevant occasions. The management's requirement in the conditions of the abdication's aftermath was more acute than the management's requirement in the conditions of the second son's position had been, because the institutional demands of the Queen's position were the institutional demands of the most significant available constitutional role, rather than the supporting roles requirements. The acuity of the management's requirement was the acuity of the specific demands that the coronation and the subsequent management of the reign's institutional dimensions imposed on both parties in the conditions where Elizabeth's capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the most acute demands. The coronation was May 12, 1937. George VI's performance of the coronation ceremony was the performance of someone whose stammer and whose anxiety about the public performance's demands had been managed through the sustained application of the Logue techniques in the specific preparation for the ceremony's requirements, and whose management of the ceremony's demands in the conditions of the preparation's application produced the specific public account of a coronation whose central figure had met the ceremony's requirements with sufficient competence for the relevant public account to organize itself around the positive dimensions of the performance rather than around the difficulties the preparation had been organized around managing. The management was effective in the specific sense of producing the public account the institutional management required. Elizabeth's presence at the coronation and her management of the relevant social dimensions of the occasion was the presence and the management of someone whose specific capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the most acute social demands of the most significant public occasion of the relevant institutional life's opening phase. The opening phase's management established the pattern that the subsequent years of the reign's management would express, with the consistency of something built into the functional organization of the relevant institutional life, rather than produced by the specific events of the specific phases. Elizabeth managed the social dimensions. George VI managed the constitutional dimensions in the conditions where the constitutional management's requirements were organized around his authority rather than around her capabilities. The division of the relevant management's demands between the two parties to the marriage was the division that the specific capabilities and the specific formation of each party to the marriage had produced as the natural functional organization of the relevant shared life. The natural functional organization was the organization of the marriage's management of the institutional demands across the full span of the relevant period. The organization reflected the specific power dynamic this account has been examining across the preceding sections, and whose operation in the specific conditions of the abdication's aftermath was the operation of the same fundamental dynamic in the more demanding institutional conditions that the abdication had produced. The more demanding institutional conditions required the more consistent deployment of Elizabeth's specific capabilities in the service of the management's requirements, and the more consistent deployment required the more consistent subordination of the full range of the personal relationship's other dimensions to the management's demands in the conditions where the demands were most acute. The subordination was the specific cost that the abdication's transformation of the marriage's institutional dimensions imposed on the personal relationship's private texture, and the cost was real in the specific sense of being the cost of the management's consistent requirement in the conditions of the more demanding institutional life's daily texture. What the abdication actually did to the marriage, stated in the direct terms that the honest account requires, rather than in the sympathetic terms the brand's preferred account of the relevant event has always organized around, was this. It transformed the marriage's institutional dimensions from the manageable demands of the second son's position into the most acute institutional demands available in the relevant world, organized around the management of the constitutional role in the conditions of a man whose formation had not produced the specific preparation for the role's requirements, and whose management of those requirements was therefore the management of someone deploying the available capabilities in the conditions of the insufficient preparation with the support of the specific social capability that his wife's formation had produced, and that the marriage's functional organization had always organized around the management's requirements. The transformation required Elizabeth's capabilities more consistently and more completely than the second son's position had required them, and the requirement's consistent operation in the conditions of the more demanding institutional life's daily texture produced the specific dynamic of the marriage's later decades in a more concentrated form than the preceding years had produced it. The concentration was the concentration of the power dynamics operation in the more demanding conditions, expressed with the greater intensity that the more demanding conditions imposed on the functional organization's management requirements. The Wallace-Simpson dimension of the abdication's aftermath requires examination here, because the specific quality of Elizabeth's response to Wallace-Simpson was the most personally revealing dimension of the abdication's aftermath, for the honest account of Elizabeth's character and the specific priorities that the social intelligence was organized around serving. Elizabeth never forgave Wallace-Simpson. The not forgiving was the not forgiving that the relevant biographical accounts of the period document with the consistency of multiple independent sources whose accounts of Elizabeth's private assessment of Wallace-Simpson are organized around the same specific qualities of the assessment across the full span of the relevant period. The private assessment was the assessment of someone who had never accepted Wallace-Simpson's legitimacy in the relevant world, and whose management of the relevant relationships across the subsequent decades of the widowhood was organized around the consistent expression of the non-acceptance through the specific mechanisms of the relevant social management. The non-acceptance was organized around the specific quality of Elizabeth's understanding of what Wallace-Simpson's presence in the relevant world represented for the institutional management of the relevant circumstances. Wallace-Simpson was the woman whose relationship with Edward VI had produced the abdication that had placed Albert on the throne in the conditions of the insufficient preparation. The placement in the conditions of the insufficient preparation was the placement that had imposed the specific demands on both parties to the marriage that the subsequent decades of the reign had required to be managed with the specific resources that the management's requirements had consistently demanded. The demands had been considerable. The management had been Elizabeth's primary functional contribution to the marriage's institutional life across the relevant period. The Wallace-Simpson connection to the demands was the connection that the honest account of Elizabeth's response to Wallace-Simpson requires to be placed alongside the institutional account of the abdication's constitutional dimensions, because the personal dimension of the response was the response of someone whose private assessment of the relevant circumstances was organized around the specific costs that the abdication had imposed on the marriage's institutional dimensions, and whose attribution of the responsibility for those costs was the attribution of someone who understood the chain of causation with the specific clarity of the relevant social intelligence's operation in the conditions of the full picture's accurate assessment. Wallace-Simpson had caused the abdication. The abdication had placed Albert on the throne. The throne had imposed the most acute institutional demands on the marriage's functional organization. The demands had required Elizabeth's consistent and complete deployment of the specific capabilities that the management's requirements had organized around her contribution. The consistent and complete deployment had been the primary activity of the marriage's management of the institutional demands across the subsequent 2 decades of the reign. The attribution was clear to Elizabeth's social intelligence. The non-forgiving was the expression of the attribution. The expression was consistent across the full span of the relevant period and the subsequent decades of the widowhood, organized around the specific mechanisms of the relevant social management through which Elizabeth communicated her assessment of the relevant people and situations, without the direct statement that the direct statement would have required. The mechanisms were the same mechanisms that the social intelligence had always deployed in the management of the relevant relationships and the relevant circumstances. The warmth withheld in the specific conditions where the withholding communicated the assessment, the social distance maintained in the relevant occasions where the distance communicated the conclusion, the specific quality of the engagement managed to the specific register that communicated the institutional assessment without the direct statement that the code was organized around not requiring. Wallace-Simpson received the full operation of the mechanisms across the subsequent decades. The operation was consistent. The assessment was clear. The expression of the assessment through the mechanisms was the expression of the social intelligence's primary instrument, deployed in the specific conditions of the most sustained personal hostility that the relevant period's circumstances had produced in the person deploying it. The hostility was real. It was organized around the specific attribution of the responsibility for the costs the abdication had imposed on the marriage's institutional dimensions. The costs were real. The attribution was Elizabeth's. The expression of the attribution was the consistent operation of the social intelligence's primary instrument in the specific conditions of the most sustained personal hostility the relevant period produced. The abdication did that to the marriage. It transformed the institutional dimensions. It concentrated the power dynamics operation in the more demanding conditions. It produced in Elizabeth the specific attribution of the responsibility for the transformation's costs, whose expression was the most sustained personal hostility of the relevant period's management of the relevant relationships. The transformation, the concentration, and the hostility were all the abdication's specific products in the conditions of the marriage that the abdication had permanently altered. The marriage was darker for all three. The Blitz began on September 7, 1940, when the Luftwaffe shifted its primary bombing campaign from RAF airfields to London, and the specific quality of the destruction it produced across the subsequent months of the sustained bombing campaign generated in the British public the specific combination of genuine suffering and determined resistance that the wartime account of the period organized the national narrative around. The bombing was real. The suffering was real. The destruction of the relevant residential and commercial areas of London and the other major cities that the campaign subsequently extended to was real in the specific sense of producing genuine casualties and genuine material destruction that the relevant official statistics document with the precision of the institutional record. The Queen Consort's response to the Blitz was the response that the public account of the wartime years organized the most celebrated dimension of the Queen Mother's legacy around: the visits to the bombed areas. The specific quality of the engagement with the people whose homes and whose streets the bombing had destroyed, conducted in the specific register of the warmth and the genuine engaged attention to the person in front of her that had always been the most immediate expression of her social capability. The staying in London when the relevant advice had communicated the specific dangers of remaining in the city rather than withdrawing to the safer conditions of the countryside that the relevant security assessment identified as the appropriate management of the constitutional requirement to maintain the safety of the relevant principles. The famous statement attributed to her following the bombing of Buckingham Palace on September 13, 1940, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face," was the statement that the public account of the wartime years organized around as the most direct available expression of the specific quality of the wartime conduct that the relevant period's management had been producing as the public account of the Queen Consort's engagement with the relevant circumstances. The statement was the statement that the public account required, the specific combination of genuine courage and genuine empathy for the people whose circumstances the bombing had produced, expressed in the direct terms of someone whose public account was organized around the honest expression of the genuine feeling rather than the managed performance of the appropriate sentiment. The statement was genuine in the sense that the relevant accounts of the relevant period consistently describe Elizabeth's engagement with the bombed areas and the people whose circumstances the bombing had produced as the genuine engagement of someone whose social capability was the genuine expression of the formed character rather than the managed performance of the appropriate conduct. She was genuinely present in the relevant visits. She was genuinely engaged with the people in front of her in the specific conditions of the visits. The warmth was the genuine expression rather than the performed expression. The public account of the wartime conduct was organized around the genuine dimensions. The organization served the institutional management of the relevant public accounts requirements in the specific conditions of the wartime period. When the management of the public accounts narrative was organized around the specific combination of genuine courage and genuine dedication to the national cause that the wartime circumstances required the relevant principles to demonstrate in the public dimensions of the relevant role. The genuine dimensions were real, and their specific quality was the quality of someone whose formation had produced the relevant capabilities as the natural expression of the formed character, rather than as the managed performance against the natural inclinations. The wartime conduct's genuineness was therefore the genuineness of the natural expression, rather than the performed expression, and the natural expression's specific quality in the conditions of the wartime period was the quality that the public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of who Elizabeth was and what the marriage represented in the conditions of the most demanding available circumstances. The private reality of the wartime marriage was more complicated than the public accounts organization around the genuine dimensions allowed. The complication was the complication of the same fundamental conditions that the marriage's functional organization had always been organized around: the stammer and the anxiety, and the specific power dynamic that the relevant capabilities distribution had established from the marriage's beginning, operating in the more demanding conditions of the wartime period, rather than the conditions of the peacetime institutional life. George VI's wartime conduct was the conduct that the relevant biographical accounts of the period consistently describe in terms that reflect the genuine dimensions of someone who was meeting the constitutional role's most demanding available requirements in the conditions of the insufficient preparation that the abdication had imposed, and whose management of those requirements in the wartime conditions was the management of someone deploying the available capabilities with the specific commitment that the relevant accounts identify as one of the most consistent features of his engagement with the constitutional demands. The commitment was genuine. The specific quality of George VI's wartime engagement with the constitutional role's requirements, the visits to the bombed areas, the meetings with Churchill, the management of the relevant constitutional machinery in the conditions of the most acute national crisis available in the relevant period, was the engagement of someone whose genuine commitment to the institutional duty was the organizing principle of the relevant conduct, rather than the performed commitment of someone managing the public accounts requirements against natural alternative inclinations. The commitment was also organized around the specific management of the relevant circumstances in the conditions of the limitations that the formation had produced alongside the commitment, and the management of the relevant circumstances in the conditions of those limitations was the management that Elizabeth's specific capabilities provided as the primary functional resource of the marriage's management of the institutional demands in the wartime conditions. The specific dimensions of the private reality that the public account was most consistently organized around not presenting as the available account of the wartime marriage are the dimensions whose honest examination requires the engagement with the sources whose proximity to the private dimensions of the marriage's daily texture gave them the accurate observational access to what the marriage actually was in the conditions of the wartime period, rather than what the public account was organized around presenting it as being. The household staff's accounts of the wartime period are among the sources whose proximity to the private dimensions provides the most direct available evidence of the marriage's private texture in the wartime conditions. The accounts describe the specific quality of the household's daily life in the conditions of the wartime period, the specific quality of George VI's anxiety in the private conditions of the household rather than the public conditions of the relevant occasions, the particular texture of the domestic life organized around the management of that anxiety alongside the management of the wartime period's acute institutional demands. The anxiety in the private conditions was the anxiety that the stammer and the formation had produced as the consistent background of the daily life rather than the specific anxiety of the wartime period's exceptional demands. The wartime period's exceptional demands added the specific additional anxiety of the most acute available national circumstances to the consistent background anxiety that the formation had produced, and the combination of the consistent background and the additional layer was the combination that the private conditions of the household's daily life in the wartime period expressed. Elizabeth's management of the combination in the private conditions was the management that the marriage's functional organization had always organized around her capabilities as the primary resource, applied in the more demanding conditions of the wartime period's additional layer of acute anxiety alongside the consistent background. The management was more demanding in the wartime conditions for the same reason that everything in the wartime period was more demanding. The additional layer of acute anxiety produced by the most significant available national crisis imposed on every dimension of the relevant daily life the specific additional demands of the crisis's conditions. The management was more demanding. Elizabeth provided the management with the specific consistency of someone whose capabilities were the genuine expression of the formed character, rather than the managed performance against natural alternative inclinations. The provision was genuine in its specific dimensions, and its consistency was the consistency of the natural expression, rather than the managed performance. The specific quality of the wartime marriage's private reality, alongside the public account's celebrated dimensions, is the quality that the honest account requires to be examined in the direct terms of what the available evidence supports, rather than in the terms of the public accounts organization around the celebrated dimensions in isolation from the private reality's more complicated picture. The more complicated picture includes the specific quality of George VI's health across the wartime years. The relevant biographical accounts of the period document the progressive deterioration of George VI's health across the wartime years, with the specific detail that the relevant medical record and the relevant biographical sources provide. The deterioration was real, and its specific dimensions, the arteriosclerosis, the lung cancer, the specific health trajectory that the relevant medical assessment of the period documents with the precision of the available record, were the dimensions of a health trajectory whose development across the wartime years and the subsequent post-war period was shaped, in part by the specific demands that the wartime conditions imposed on someone whose formation had not equipped him for the relevant requirements, and whose management of those requirements, in the conditions of the insufficient preparation, was the management of sustained deployment of the available capabilities in conditions of sustained and acute demand. The sustained and acute demand had costs. The costs were the costs of the sustained deployment in the conditions of the relevant demands, and the specific health trajectory that the available record documents across the wartime years and the post-war period was the trajectory whose development, the sustained costs, contributed to producing in the conditions of the relevant medical history. Elizabeth's response to the deterioration of George VI's health across the wartime years was the response that the management of the relevant circumstances in the conditions of the deterioration required, organized around the specific capabilities whose deployment in the conditions of the relevant demands was the consistent expression of the marriage's functional organization. The management required the management of the specific circumstances of the deterioration alongside the management of the institutional demands that the constitutional roles requirements continued to impose on both parties to the marriage in the conditions of the deterioration's progressive development. The management of both simultaneously was the management of someone whose specific capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the most acute available demands, and whose deployment of those capabilities in the conditions of the simultaneous requirement was the consistent deployment rather than the occasional deployment that the less demanding conditions of the peacetime institutional life had required. The wartime period and the post-war period together produced the specific health trajectory whose terminal phase was the February 1952 death at 56. The death is the subject of Part 9's examination of the widowhood's specific conditions. What requires examination here is the specific quality of the wartime period's contribution to the trajectory, the specific costs of the sustained deployment in the conditions of the most acute available demands, imposed on someone whose formation had not produced the specific preparation for the role's requirements, and whose management of those requirements in the conditions of the insufficient preparation was the sustained deployment of the available capabilities in the conditions of the relevant demands. The costs were real, the trajectory was real, the contribution of the wartime period's specific conditions to the trajectory was real, in the specific sense of being the specific contribution of the most acute available demands, sustained imposition on the available capabilities in the conditions of the insufficient preparation. The public account of the wartime marriage was organized around the genuine dimensions of the wartime conduct. The genuine dimensions were real. The private reality was more complicated than the public account allowed. The complication was the complication of the same fundamental conditions whose operation in the more demanding wartime circumstances produced the specific quality of the private reality alongside the genuine dimensions of the public account's celebrated conduct. The celebrated conduct was Elizabeth visiting the bombed areas with the warmth and the genuine engaged attention that the public account organized itself around. The private reality was Elizabeth managing the consistent anxiety and the progressive health deterioration and the specific demands of the wartime institutional life in the conditions of the marriage's functional organization, organized around the deployment of the specific capabilities that the management's requirements demanded in the conditions of the most acute available national crisis's imposition on the relevant daily life. Both the celebrated conduct and the private reality were real. Both were Elizabeth's. Both were the wartime marriage's simultaneous dimensions. The honest account holds both, rather than organizing itself around the celebrated dimensions in isolation from the private reality, whose honest examination the public account was organized around, preventing from becoming the available account of the relevant subject. The wartime years built the myth. The myth was built on genuine foundations. The genuine foundations were not the full account. The full account includes what was behind the genuine foundations. What was behind them was the private reality this section has examined. The private reality was darker than the myth allowed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The official account of the Queen Mother's relationship with her daughters is organized around the warmth, the family closeness, the specific quality of the maternal engagement with Elizabeth and Margaret across the childhood years, the particular devotion of a mother whose love for her daughters was one of the most consistently celebrated dimensions of the public account of who the Queen Mother was and what the relevant relationships in her life were organized around. The warmth was the warmth the brand required for this specific dimension of the public account, and its production across the full span of the relevant period was the production organized around the genuine dimensions of the relationship, alongside the management of the dimensions the brand was organized around, not presenting as the available account. The genuine dimensions were real. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was genuinely fond of her daughters, in the specific sense that the fondness was the expression of something real, rather than the performed expression of the appropriate sentiment. She was present in specific moments of their childhood, in the warmth that the relevant accounts of people who knew the family across the relevant years consistently describe. The warmth of the specific moments was the warmth of the genuine expression rather than the managed performance, and the genuine expression's specific quality in the conditions of the relevant moments was the quality that the public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of the maternal relationship's character. The genuine dimensions were not the full account. The full account requires the examination of the specific ways that the Queen Mother's parenting across the childhood and adolescent years of both daughters reflected the consistent operation of the same primary organizational principle that organized everything else in her adult life: the management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the clearly understood priorities, expressed through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment in service of the institutional management's requirements, rather than in service of the full dimensions of the personal relationships that the relevant circumstances simultaneously required. The specific ways the parenting reflected this operation were the ways whose honest examination produces the picture of a parenting whose specific character was the character of someone whose primary deployment of the relevant capabilities was organized around the management of the institutional demands, rather than around the full provision of what the daughter's specific developmental requirements demanded of the primary parental relationship across the years of the relevant formation. The formation years were the years when the parenting's specific character was most consequential for the daughters it was shaping, and the specific character of the parenting across those years was the character of someone who was genuinely warm in the specific moments of the relevant engagement, and who was consistently managing the institutional demands in the conditions where the management's requirements were most acute, which were the conditions that occupied the primary deployment of the available capabilities, rather than the full provision of what the daughter's developmental requirements demanded of the primary parental relationship. Marion Crawford's account of the household across the relevant years is the most directly available primary source for the specific character of the parenting's daily texture, and Crawford's account describes the specific quality of the family life in terms that the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be read against the management of the primary source's publication context, rather than simply against the warmth of the specific moments the account celebrates. Crawford was dismissed from royal service following the publication of The Little Princesses in 1950, and the specific quality of the institutional response to the publication reflects the institutional management's assessment of what the account had revealed about the relevant dimensions of the family life, rather than simply the breach of protocol that the official account of the dismissal organized itself around. What the account had revealed, in the specific dimensions whose honest examination the institutional response suggests the management found most uncomfortable, was the specific quality of the household's daily life in the conditions where the primary parental engagement was most reduced by the management's consistent demands. The specific quality of a household whose primary female figure was frequently engaged in the management of the institutional demands and the relevant social relationships, rather than in the sustained daily provision of the primary maternal engagement that the daughter's developmental requirements demanded. The daughters were aware of the reduction. The awareness was the awareness of children who are perceptive enough to observe the specific quality of the available engagement and who develop, through the observation, the specific adaptive responses to the reduction that the reduction's consistent presence in the daily life produces in the people who experience it. Elizabeth was the more adaptive of the two daughters, in the specific sense of having developed the adaptive response of the responsible one. The daughter whose formation had absorbed the institutional management's primary organizational principle as the natural condition of the relevant world, rather than as the specific imposition of the parenting's particular character, and who therefore experienced the parenting's reduction of the full maternal provision as the natural condition of the relevant life, rather than as the specific deprivation whose honest examination would have required acknowledging what the reduction was reducing. The absorption was the formation's most significant product for Elizabeth's specific character. The absorption of the institutional management's primary organizational principle as the natural condition of the relevant world was the absorption that the subsequent decades of Elizabeth's management of the constitutional role expressed with the consistency of something built into the formation rather than maintained against natural alternative inclinations. The formation had built it in. The parenting's specific character had contributed to the building by organizing the daily texture of the relevant childhood around the consistent demonstration of the institutional management's primary organizational principle in the conditions of the primary parental relationship's most reduced dimensions. Margaret was the less adaptive of the two daughters in the specific sense of having developed the adaptive response of someone whose formation had not absorbed the institutional management's primary organizational principle as the natural condition of the relevant world, because the parenting's specific character had demonstrated the principle's operation in conditions whose honest assessment the formation had not organized around producing the absorptive response toward. The non-absorptive response was the response of someone who experienced the parenting's reduction of the full maternal provision as the specific reduction it was, rather than as the natural condition of the relevant life, and who developed through the experience the specific adaptive response of someone whose formation had produced the awareness of the reduction alongside the capabilities whose natural expression the institutional management's primary organizational principle had never provided adequate space for. The awareness and the capabilities were the formation that the subsequent decades of Margaret's adult life expressed with the consistency of the formed character's natural expression rather than the managed performance against natural alternative inclinations. The parenting's specific character had contributed to the formation by organizing the daily texture of the relevant childhood around the consistent demonstration of the institutional management's primary organizational principle in conditions where the formation's honest assessment produced the awareness of what the demonstration was demonstrating rather than the absorptive response that Elizabeth's formation had organized around. The specific dimensions of the Queen Mother's parenting that the honest examination requires to be named, in the direct terms the honest naming demands, are the dimensions whose honest examination the official account has always been most organized around preventing from becoming the available account of the relevant subject. The first dimension was the management of the daughters' emotional lives in the specific register of the institutional management's primary organizational principle, rather than in the register of the full provision of the primary maternal engagement that the daughters' developmental requirements demanded. The management of the emotional lives in the institutional management's register was the management of someone whose social intelligence was consistently deployed in the service of the institutional interest, rather than in the service of the full dimensions of the primary parental relationship's requirements. The specific quality of the management in the relevant conditions was the quality of warmth organized around the institutional management's requirements, rather than around the daughter's specific developmental needs in the conditions where the developmental needs were most acute. The warmth was genuine in its specific expressions. The organization around the institutional management's requirements rather than the developmental needs was also genuine in the specific sense of being the natural expression of the formed character's primary organizational principle rather than the deliberate choice against the developmental needs' acknowledged priority. The second dimension was the management of the Townsend situation, which this account has examined in the preceding script on the Margaret and Townsend affair, and which the honest account of the parenting's specific character requires to be acknowledged here as the most consequential single demonstration of the parenting's primary organizational principles operation in the conditions of the most acute available conflict between the daughter's specific interests and the institutional management's assessment of the institutional interest. The management of the Townsend situation was the management of the institutional assessment's consistent communication to Margaret through the specific mechanisms of the Queen Mother's influence on the relevant relationships, organized around the institutional conclusion, rather than around the honest provision of the available options that the daughter's specific interests required. The management served the institutional interest. The cost was Margaret's. The payment of the cost across the subsequent 50 years of the Townsend decision's aftermath was the most sustained and the most directly documented evidence of what the parenting's specific character produced in the specific person who bore the most direct consequences of the primary organizational principle's consistent operation. The third dimension was the management of both daughters' formation in the specific conditions of a royal household whose primary female figure's deployment of the available capabilities was organized around the institutional management's requirements, rather than around the full provision of what the daughter's developmental requirements demanded of the primary parental relationship across the years of the relevant formation. The formation the parenting produced was the formation that the subsequent decades of both daughters' adult lives expressed. Elizabeth's formation produced the woman whose primary organizational principle was the institutional obligation's consistent priority, expressed in the management of the constitutional role across 70 years with the consistency of something built into the formation rather than maintained against natural alternative inclinations. Margaret's formation produced the woman whose adult life was organized around the management of the accumulated losses that the institutional management's consistent priority had imposed across the relevant decades. Both formations were the parenting's products. The parenting produced both through the consistent operation of the primary organizational principle in the conditions of the daughter's formation across the relevant years. The operation was genuine in the sense of being the natural expression of the formed character rather than the deliberate production of specific outcomes in the daughter's formations. The genuineness of the operation did not reduce its specific consequences for the formations it produced. The formations were real. The consequences were real. The parenting that produced both was the parenting of someone whose primary organizational principle was the institutional management's consistent priority, expressed in the conditions of the primary parental relationship with the same consistency that it was expressed in every other dimension of the relevant adult life. The warmth was real within those conditions. The warmth was not the full account. The full account includes the specific character of the parenting whose operation, in the conditions of the primary parental relationship, produced the formations that the subsequent decades of both daughters' adult lives expressed with the consistency of things built into the formation, rather than maintained against natural alternative inclinations. The formations built in through the parenting were the formations the parenting's specific character was organized around producing, expressed through the consistent operation of the primary organizational principle in the conditions where the principle's application was the natural expression of the formed character whose primary organizational principle it was. The Queen Mother was genuinely fond of her daughters. The fondness was organized around the institutional management's primary organizational principle in the specific conditions where the principle's application and the fondness's expression were simultaneously present. The simultaneous presence was the parenting's specific character. The specific character produced the formations it produced. The formations were Elizabeth and Margaret's adult characters. The adult characters expressed what the formations had built. The building was the parenting's most significant product. The product was darker than the warmth the official account organized itself around. The Queen Mother drank. This is the dimension of the official account's management of the relevant subject, that the management organized around the specific register of affectionate acknowledgement, rather than the honest examination, because the affectionate acknowledgement served the brand's requirements in the conditions of a personal habit whose specific dimensions were sufficiently visible in the relevant world to require some form of acknowledgement, while the brand's management of the relevant subject required the acknowledgement to be organized around the affectionate register rather than the honest examination. The affectionate register produced the specific public account of the drinking as one of the charming eccentricities of an extraordinary woman whose relationship with alcohol was the relationship of someone who enjoyed the pleasures of the relevant social world with the specific enthusiasm of a person of genuine appetite for the good things that the relevant life provided. The gin and dubonnet before lunch, the wine with lunch, the whiskey in the afternoon, the champagne at the relevant occasions, the specific quantities that the relevant accounts of the household staff, who managed the practical dimensions of the relevant consumption document, with the precision of people whose professional function required them to manage the quantities rather than simply observe them. The household staff accounts are the most directly available primary evidence for the specific quantities involved in the relevant consumption across the decades of the relevant period, and their accounts are consistent enough across the independent sources to support the conclusion that the consumption was not the moderate social drinking that the affectionate register's account organized itself around presenting as the relevant account of the subject. The consumption was the consumption of someone whose relationship with alcohol across the relevant decades was the relationship of sustained daily consumption at levels that the relevant medical assessment of comparable consumption in comparable conditions would not have organized around the affectionate register's preferred account of the charming eccentricity. The specific quantities documented in the household staff accounts across the relevant biographical sources are quantities that the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be placed in the context of the specific medical understanding of sustained alcohol consumption at comparable levels rather than in the context of the affectionate register's preferred account of the relevant subject. The medical context produces a different picture from the affectionate register's picture, and the different picture is the picture that the honest account of the drinking requires to be examined in the direct terms of what the evidence supports, rather than in the terms of the brand's preferred account of the relevant subject. The picture is the picture of someone whose sustained daily consumption across the decades of the relevant period was consumption at levels that the relevant medical understanding of the specific consequences of sustained consumption at comparable levels consistently associates with the specific health consequences and the specific psychological consequences that the sustained consumption produces in the people who experience it across the relevant duration. The health consequences were real in the specific sense of contributing to the health trajectory that the Queen Mother's later decades expressed, organized around the specific combination of the relevant physical conditions whose development across the later decades of the relevant period, the available medical record documents, with the precision that the institutional management's management of the public account of the relevant subject permitted to become the available account. The psychological consequences were real in the specific sense of contributing to the specific quality of the Queen Mother's engagement with the relevant circumstances across the decades of the widowhood. The particular quality of someone whose sustained daily consumption across decades of the relevant period produced in the daily texture of the relevant life, the specific dimensions of the sustained consumption's psychological consequences, alongside the genuine social engagement and the genuine warmth that the public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of who the Queen Mother was in the conditions of the relevant engagement. What the drinking revealed about the character the official account celebrated is the dimension of the honest examination that the affectionate register's management of the relevant subject was most organized around preventing from becoming the available account. The revelation is the revelation not of a charming eccentricity, but of the specific relationship between the sustained consumption and the specific conditions of the life that the sustained consumption was the consistent response to across the decades of the relevant period. The relationship between the drinking and the specific conditions of the life is the relationship that the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be examined in the context of what is known about the specific conditions of the relevant life rather than in isolation from those conditions, as the self-contained fact of a personal habit whose specific character, the affectionate register's account, was organized around presenting as independent of the relevant conditions. The specific conditions of the relevant life whose relationship to the drinking the honest examination requires to be examined are the conditions this account has been assembling across the preceding sections. The specific demands of the marriage's functional organization, the particular quality of the wartime years' sustained deployment of the available capabilities in the conditions of the most acute available national crisis, the specific character of the parenting's operation in the conditions of the primary parental relationship's most acute demands, and the specific quality of the widowhood's 50 years in the conditions of the most significant available personal losses' permanent presence in the daily texture of the relevant life. George VI's death in February 1952 was the most significant single event in the Queen Mother's adult life, in the specific sense of being the event whose consequences were most permanently present in the daily texture of the subsequent 50 years of the widowhood. The death removed the person whose position in the marriage's functional organization had been the organizing fact of the marriage's institutional dimensions across the 28 years of the marriage's duration, and whose removal produced in the subsequent 50 years the specific conditions of the most significant available personal losses' permanent presence in the daily texture of the widowhood. The drinking across the 50 years of the widowhood was the drinking of someone whose sustained daily consumption was the consistent response to the specific conditions of the widowhood's daily texture organized around the most significant available personal losses' permanent presence. The response was not the deliberate management of the loss through the specific mechanism of alcohol's provision of the distance that the loss's permanent presence required to be managed into the background of the daily life. The response was the more organic relationship between the sustained consumption and the specific conditions of the life that the sustained consumption had always been the consistent response to across the relevant decades of the relevant period. The organic relationship was the relationship that the honest account of the drinking requires to be examined, rather than the simpler account of the charming eccentricity that the affectionate register's management of the relevant subject organized itself around presenting. The organic relationship is the relationship between a specific personal habit and the specific conditions of a life that the habit was the consistent response to across the decades of the relevant period, produced through the interaction of the specific conditions and the specific character whose primary organizational principle was the management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the clearly understood priorities through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment. The social intelligence's deployment in the conditions of the sustained consumption's consistent presence was the deployment of someone whose primary instruments were operating in the conditions where the sustained consumption's consistent presence was the consistent background of the daily life, rather than the specific occasion of the relevant engagement. The instruments operated in those conditions with the specific quality of someone whose social capability was the genuine expression of the formed character, rather than the managed performance against the natural inclinations, whose natural expression would have been the honest acknowledgement of the specific conditions the sustained consumption was the consistent response to. The honest acknowledgement was not the Queen Mother's primary instrument. The management of the preferred account was the primary instrument. The management of the preferred account in the conditions of the sustained consumption's consistent presence was the management of someone whose social intelligence was deployed in the service of the brand's requirements, rather than in the service of the honest engagement with the specific conditions that the brand was organized around, not presenting as the available account of the relevant subject. The brand presented the charming eccentricity. The honest account requires the specific relationship between the sustained consumption and the specific conditions of the life across the decades of the relevant period, examined in the direct terms of what the relationship was, rather than in the terms of the affectionate register's preferred account of the relevant subject. The relationship was the relationship of sustained daily consumption across the decades of the relevant period, as the consistent response to the specific conditions of a life organized around the management of the institutional demands and the relevant personal losses in the conditions where the management's requirements were most acute and the loss's presence in the daily texture was most permanent. The management of the institutional demands was real, and its specific demands across the relevant decades were the demands this account has examined. The relevant personal losses were real, and the most significant of them was George VI's death in February 1952, and the 50 years of the widowhood's organization around the most significant available personal losses' permanent presence in the daily texture of the relevant life. The sustained consumption was the consistent response to both. The response was not the deliberate strategy of someone who had assessed the relevant circumstances and concluded that the sustained consumption was the optimal available response. The response was the more organic development of a consistent pattern across the decades of the relevant period, whose specific development reflected the interaction of the specific conditions and the specific character whose primary instruments were the management of the preferred account, rather than the honest engagement with the specific conditions. The sustained consumption was the consistent response to. The interaction produced the pattern produced the sustained consumption. The sustained consumption produced the specific health consequences and the specific psychological consequences that the relevant decades expressed, with the consistency of something built into the daily texture of the relevant life, rather than produced by the specific events of the specific occasions. The specific health consequences were the consequences that contributed to the health trajectory, whose development across the later decades of the widowhood produced the specific conditions of the Queen Mother's last years, the hip replacement, the falls, the specific accumulation of the relevant physical conditions that the available record documents with the precision that the institutional management of the public account of the relevant subject permitted to become the available account. The specific psychological consequences were the consequences that contributed to the specific quality of the Queen Mother's engagement with the relevant circumstances across the decades of the widowhood, the particular quality of someone whose sustained daily consumption had become the consistent background of the daily life, rather than the specific occasion of the relevant engagement, organized around the management of the preferred account's production in the conditions of the consistent background, rather than around the honest engagement with what the consistent background was the consistent response to. What the drinking revealed was this: the brand's preferred account of the charming eccentricity was the management of a personal habit whose specific character was the character of sustained daily consumption across decades of the relevant period, as the consistent response to the specific conditions of a life whose management of the institutional demands and the relevant personal losses was the primary activity of the daily life's organization across the relevant period. The management of the institutional demands was real, the personal losses were real, the sustained consumption as the consistent response to both was real. The brand's management of the relevant subject, through the affectionate register's preferred account of the charming eccentricity, was the management of the honest account's prevention from becoming the available account of the relevant subject across the full span of the brand's production and the subsequent management of its legacy. The honest account is this one. The drinking revealed the specific conditions the brand was organized around not revealing. The conditions were darker than the charming eccentricity the brand organized itself around presenting. The darkness is what the honest account requires to be named. The naming is what this section has done. The Queen Mother died in March 2002, leaving an estate whose specific financial dimensions the relevant accounts of the period addressed with varying degrees of directness, and whose honest examination requires the engagement with the available evidence rather than the management of the preferred account, that the institutional management of the relevant subject has always been organized around producing in place of the honest examination. The estate was valued at approximately £14 million at the time of the death. The £14 million was the estate after the specific financial management of the preceding decades had produced its specific outcome from the relevant starting position, and the specific outcome's honest examination requires the acknowledgement of the specific financial trajectory that the relevant decades had expressed, with the consistency of something built into the character's primary organizational principle rather than produced by the specific events of the specific occasions. The primary organizational principle in the financial dimension was the organizational principle of expenditure, organized around the clearly understood priorities, rather than around the relationship between expenditure and available resource that the honest management of the relevant financial reality would have required. The priorities were the priorities of someone whose formation in the specific conditions of the Scottish aristocratic world and the Edwardian upper class had produced the ambient assumption that the relevant resources and the relevant social conditions were the natural conditions of existence rather than the specific historical product of specific historical circumstances whose continuation required the specific management of the relationship. The ambient assumption was real in the sense of being the genuine expression of the formed character's organizational principle, rather than the deliberate choice against the acknowledged alternative of the honest management of the relevant financial reality. The genuineness of the assumption did not reduce its specific consequences for the financial trajectory that the relevant decades expressed, because the genuine expression of the organizational principle in the conditions of the financial management produced the same specific consequences that the deliberate choice against the acknowledged alternative would have produced in comparable conditions. The specific consequences were the consequences of sustained expenditure organized around the clearly understood priorities, rather than around the relationship between expenditure and available resource across the decades of the widowhood. The expenditure was the expenditure of someone whose social world and whose institutional position and whose specific understanding of the relevant life's appropriate conditions were organized around the standards that the relevant formation had established as the natural conditions of existence, expressed in the specific financial decisions of the relevant decades with the consistency of someone whose primary organizational principle in the financial dimension was the expenditure organized around those standards rather than around the management of the relationship between expenditure and resource. The standards were considerable. The Clarence House establishment was the establishment of the Queen's mother, organized around the relevant institutional requirements of the position and the specific social world that the position organized around itself across the decades of the widowhood. The Castle of May in Caithness was the property that Elizabeth purchased in 1952, the year of George VI's death, whose restoration and subsequent maintenance across the decades of the widowhood was the financial expression of the specific priorities that the relevant purchase and the relevant maintenance reflected. The Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park was the residence whose upkeep and whose specific social function across the relevant decades was the financial expression of the relevant institutional position's requirements, as the Queen Mother understood those requirements to be. Each of these properties required the sustained financial management of the relevant expenditure in the conditions of the available resource, and the honest examination of the financial management across the relevant decades requires the engagement with the specific relationship between the expenditure and the available resource, rather than the management of the preferred account that the institutional management of the relevant subject has always been organized around producing. The relationship between the expenditure and the available resource was not the relationship of someone whose management of the relevant financial dimensions was organized around the honest assessment of the available resource and the adjustment of the expenditure to the honest assessment's conclusions. The relationship was the relationship of someone whose expenditure was organized around the clearly understood priorities rather than around the available resources' honest assessment, producing across the relevant decades the specific financial trajectory of someone whose sustained expenditure in excess of the available resource generated the specific financial consequences that sustained expenditure in excess of available resource reliably generates across the relevant duration. The specific financial consequences were the overdraft and the debt, whose existence across the relevant decades was the most directly documented dimension of the financial trajectory that the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be acknowledged in the direct terms of what the evidence supports, rather than in the terms of the preferred account that the institutional management of the relevant subject was organized around producing. The overdraft with Coutts, the bank that has managed the royal family's financial affairs across the relevant period, was documented in the relevant biographical accounts with varying degrees of directness, and the accounts whose examination produces the most honest available picture of the specific financial dimensions of the relevant trajectory are the accounts that engage with the specific numbers rather than with the preferred account's management of the relevant subject's financial dimensions into the background of the celebration of the other qualities the brand organized itself around. William Shawcross's authorized biography of the Queen Mother, published in 2009 with the cooperation of the relevant institutional access that the authorized biography provides, addresses the financial dimensions of the relevant period with the specific directness that the institutional cooperation permits in the authorized biography's register, rather than the full directness that the honest examination of the available evidence would require in the absence of the institutional cooperation's management of the authorized account's relevant dimensions. The specific numbers that the honest examination requires to be placed in the context of the financial trajectory are numbers that the relevant biographical accounts of the period address with the consistency of independent sources whose examination of the available evidence produces the same picture of a financial trajectory organized around the sustained expenditure in excess of the available resource across the decades of the widowhood. The picture is the picture of an overdraft that reached into the millions of pounds across the relevant decades, organized around the sustained expenditure of the Clarence House establishment and the relevant properties and the specific social world that the relevant position organized around itself, in conditions where the available resource was the resource of the civil list allocation and the private income that the relevant financial arrangements provided, rather than the unlimited resource that the expenditures organization around the clearly understood priorities implicitly assumed. The civil list allocation was the allocation that the relevant constitutional arrangements provided for the relevant institutional position's financial requirements, and its specific dimensions across the relevant decades were the dimensions of an allocation organized around the institutional assessment of the relevant position's requirements, rather than around the unlimited provision that the expenditures organization around the clearly understood priorities would have required to remain within the available resource. The gap between the allocation and the expenditure was the gap that the overdraft expressed, and the overdraft's specific dimensions across the relevant decades were the dimensions of the gap's consistent production across the sustained deployment of the expenditure in excess of the available resource. The Queen covered the gap. The specific financial arrangements between the Queen and the Queen Mother across the relevant decades were arrangements whose honest examination requires the acknowledgement of what the Queen's provision to her mother represented in the specific financial dimensions of the relevant trajectory, rather than in the terms of the familial generosity that the preferred account of the relevant arrangements organized itself around presenting. The Queen's provision was the financial management of the gap between her mother's expenditure and the available resource, organized through the specific financial arrangements that the relevant institutional management of the financial dimensions of the relevant position required in the conditions of the sustained expenditures, consistent production of the gap across the decades of the widowhood. The provision was substantial. The specific dimensions of the provision are not part of the public record, with the precision that the honest examination would ideally require for confident specific description, but the relevant biographical accounts of the period are consistent in identifying the Queen's financial support as the primary mechanism for the management of the gap that the sustained expenditures, consistent production of the overdraft required to be managed across the relevant decades. The management of the gap through the Queen's financial support was the specific financial expression of the relationship between the Queen and the Queen Mother across the relevant decades, and the honest examination of the financial dimensions of the relationship requires the acknowledgement of what the management expressed about the specific character of the Queen Mother's financial conduct and its specific consequences for the people who were required to manage the consequences of the conduct. The people required to manage the consequences were primarily the Queen, whose financial provision managed the gap that the sustained expenditures consistent production of the overdraft required to be managed, and the relevant household and financial staff, whose professional function required them to manage the specific practical dimensions of the financial trajectory in the conditions of the sustained expenditures consistent production of the relevant consequences. The financial conduct revealed about the character the official account celebrated is the same revelation that the drinking's honest examination produced, the revelation of someone whose primary organizational principle was the management of the clearly understood priorities, rather than the honest engagement with the specific conditions that the priorities' consistent pursuit imposed on the people most directly required to manage the consequences of the pursuit. The clearly understood priorities were real, in the sense of being the genuine expression of the formed character's primary organizational principle, rather than the deliberate choices against the acknowledged alternative of the honest management of the relevant financial reality. The genuineness of the priorities' expression in the specific financial decisions of the relevant decades did not reduce the specific consequences that the expression produced for the people required to manage those consequences. The consequences were the overdraft and the Queen's financial management of the gap, and the specific quality of the financial trajectory across the relevant decades, expressed with the consistency of something built into the character's primary organizational principle, rather than produced by the specific events of the specific occasions. The specific events of the specific occasions contributed to the trajectory. The Castle of May purchase in 1952 was the specific financial decision whose consequences across the subsequent decades of the relevant restoration and maintenance contributed to the trajectory's development. The Clarence House establishment's specific scale was the financial decision whose sustained maintenance across the decades of the widowhood contributed to the trajectory's consistent production of the gap between the expenditure and the available resource. The racing was the most publicly acknowledged of the specific financial commitments that contributed to the trajectory. The Queen Mother's engagement with horse racing across the relevant decades was the engagement of someone whose specific investment in the racing was the investment of genuine passion rather than the managed performance of the appropriate aristocratic interest in the relevant activity. The passion was genuine. The specific financial dimensions of the investment were the dimensions of a genuine passion pursued with the specific enthusiasm of someone whose organizational principle in the financial dimension was organized around the clearly understood priorities rather than around the management of the relationship between expenditure and available resource. The genuine passion and the financial consequences of its pursuit were both real. The honest account requires both, alongside the acknowledgement of the specific relationship between the genuine passion and the financial trajectory that the pursuit's consistent expression across the relevant decades produced. The racing produced genuine pleasure. The pleasure was real, and its specific quality across the relevant decades was the quality of someone whose engagement with the activity was the genuine expression of the formed character's natural inclinations rather than the managed performance of the appropriate interest. The racing also produced the specific financial consequences of a genuine passion pursued with the enthusiasm of someone whose organizational principle in the financial dimension was the priorities pursuit rather than the available resources management, and the financial consequences of the genuine passion's consistent pursuit across the relevant decades were the consequences that contributed to the trajectory whose honest examination the available evidence requires to be produced in the direct terms of what the evidence supports. The evidence supports the conclusion that the Queen Mother's financial conduct across the relevant decades was the conduct of someone whose primary organizational principle in the financial dimension was the expenditure organized around the clearly understood priorities rather than around the available resources' honest management, producing across the decades of the widowhood the specific financial trajectory of sustained expenditure in excess of available resource, whose gap the Queen's financial provision managed in the conditions of the trajectory's consistent production. The brand organized itself around the racing's warmth and the Castle of May's romantic restoration and the Clarence House establishment's gracious management rather than around the honest examination of the financial trajectory that the relevant decisions produced across the decades of the widowhood. The honest examination produces the picture the brand was organized around preventing. The picture is the picture of a financial conduct whose specific character was the character of sustained expenditure in excess of available resource, organized around the clearly understood priorities, rather than around the available resources' honest management, whose specific consequences required the Queen's financial provision to manage the gap that the sustained expenditure's consistent production of the overdraft required to be managed across the relevant decades. The gap was real, the provision was real, the financial conduct that produced both was real. The brand was organized around presenting none of the three as the available account of the relevant subject. The honest account presents all three. George VI died at Sandringham on February 6, 1952. He had gone to bed the previous evening in the conditions of someone whose health trajectory across the preceding years had been the trajectory whose terminal phase the relevant medical assessment had been monitoring with the specific attention of people whose professional function required them to manage the public account of the relevant health dimensions alongside the honest medical assessment of the trajectory's specific implications. He was found dead in his bed at 7:30 in the morning. He was 56 years old. The cause was a coronary thrombosis, which was the terminal event in the specific health trajectory whose development across the wartime years and the post-war period this account has examined in the preceding sections. The death was not unexpected in the specific sense that the relevant medical assessment had been organized around the trajectory's terminal phase for a sufficient period to have prepared the relevant principles for the terminal event's eventual occurrence. The preparation for the eventual occurrence was not the same as the experience of the occurrence itself, and the experience of the occurrence in the specific conditions of the February 1952 morning at Sandringham was the experience of something whose preparation could reduce the surprise without eliminating the specific quality of the loss that the occurrence produced in the person closest to the relevant person for whom the occurrence was the most significant event of the relevant adult life. Elizabeth was 51 years old when her husband died. She had been married to him for 28 years. The marriage had been the primary institutional and personal context of her adult life across those 28 years, organized around the specific functional organization that this account has examined across the preceding sections, and whose management across the relevant decades had been the primary deployment of the specific capabilities that her formation had produced as the natural expression of the formed character. The death removed the primary context. The removal was the removal of the organizing fact of the adult life's most significant dimensions, the institutional demands whose management had been the primary deployment of the available capabilities, the personal relationship whose functional organization had structured the daily life around the specific dynamic this account has examined, and the specific social world that the marriage's institutional dimensions had organized around the relevant position across the 28 years of the marriage's duration. The 50 years of widowhood that followed were the 50 years whose specific character required the management of the primary context's removal in the conditions of someone whose adult life had been organized around the primary context across its most significant decades, and whose management of the removal produced the specific quality of the widowhood that the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be examined in the direct terms of what the evidence supports, rather than in the terms of the preferred account that the institutional management of the public account of the relevant subject organized itself around producing. The preferred account was the account of a gracious widowhood, the Clarence House establishment, the racing, the Castle of May, the specific social world of the relevant position's management across the 50 years, organized around the warmth and the continued engagement with the relevant life's pleasures that the public account presented as the primary evidence of someone whose resilience in the conditions of the most significant available personal loss was itself one of the most celebrated dimensions of the public account of who the Queen Mother was. The resilience was real in the specific sense of being the genuine expression of the formed character's primary organizational principle, applied to the conditions of the most significant available personal loss, rather than the managed performance of the appropriate response to the relevant circumstances. The primary organizational principle was the management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the clearly understood priorities through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment, and the management of the widowhood's conditions through the consistent deployment of those instruments was the resilience's specific expression in the conditions of the most significant available personal loss. The management produced the specific quality of the widowhood that the public account organized itself around as the primary evidence of the resilience. The Clarence House establishment's organization around the relevant social world, the racing's sustained engagement across the decades, the Castle of May's maintenance as the specific physical expression of the clearly understood priorities in the conditions of the Scottish retreat, and the specific social life of someone whose position in the relevant world continued to organize a significant social world around itself across the 5 decades of the widowhood. The Clarence House establishment was the establishment that the Queen organized for her mother following the accession, providing the relevant residence and the relevant household staff, and the specific institutional support that the position of the Queen's mother required in the conditions of the relevant institutional arrangements. The establishment was substantial in the specific sense of being organized around the relevant institutional requirements of the position rather than around the minimum provision that the relevant circumstances might have required in the conditions of a different assessment of the relevant priorities. The establishment's specific character was the character of someone whose management of the relevant circumstances in the conditions of the primary context's removal required the organization of the available resources around the clearly understood priorities in the specific form that the Clarence House establishment expressed across the decades of the widowhood. The establishment was the physical and institutional expression of the priorities' consistent pursuit in the conditions of the widowhood's specific management of the primary context's removal. The racing was the most publicly celebrated of the specific activities that the widowhood organized around the clearly understood priorities. The Queen Mother's engagement with national hunt racing across the decades of the widowhood was the engagement of genuine passion pursued with the specific enthusiasm of someone whose relationship with the activity was the relationship of the genuine enthusiast rather than the managed performance of the appropriate aristocratic interest. She owned horses. She attended the relevant meetings. She engaged with the specific dimensions of the activity, the breeding, the training, the management of the relevant relationships within the racing world, with the genuine attention of someone whose interest was organized around the activity itself rather than around the social positioning that the activity's pursuit provided in the relevant world. The genuine passion was real. The Castle of May was the physical expression of a different dimension of the clearly understood priorities. The specific Scottish retreat whose purchase in 1952 and subsequent restoration across the relevant decades was the expression of something whose specific character the relevant accounts of the purchase and the restoration describe, in terms that reflect the honest examination of what the relevant decision represented in the conditions of the widowhood's specific management of the primary context's removal. The purchase was made in the year of George VI's death. The Castle of May was a derelict castle in Caithness, whose restoration was a substantial undertaking in the specific financial and practical dimensions of the relevant restoration's requirements, and whose subsequent maintenance across the decades of the widowhood was the financial expression of the clearly understood priorities' consistent pursuit across the relevant period. The decision to purchase a derelict Scottish castle in the year of the most significant available personal losses occurrence was a decision whose specific character the honest examination of the available evidence requires to be engaged with, rather than organized around the preferred account's presentation of the relevant decision as the romantic rescue of a historic property. The rescue was real in the specific sense of the physical restoration's genuine achievement across the relevant years. The specific character of the decision whose execution the relevant restoration expressed was the character of someone whose management of the primary context's removal in the conditions of the most significant available personal loss was organized around the clearly understood priorities' consistent pursuit through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment in the direction of the relevant outcome. The relevant outcome was the creation of the specific physical and social context that the widowhood's management required in the conditions of the primary context's removal. The specific place organized around the relevant pleasures and the relevant social world that provided the closest available approximation to the conditions of the relevant life that the primary context's removal had permanently altered. The approximation was the widowhood's specific achievement across the 50 years of its duration, and the achievement was genuine in the specific sense of producing the relevant approximation with the consistency of the social intelligence's sustained deployment in the relevant conditions. The approximation was the preferred account's primary evidence of the resilience that the public account organized itself around celebrating as the most significant available evidence of who the Queen Mother was in the conditions of the widowhood. The preferred account's evidence was genuine in its specific dimensions. The resilience was real. The achievement was real. The specific quality of the widowhood's approximation to the conditions of the relevant life across the 50 years was real in the sense of producing the relevant social world and the relevant pleasures with the consistency of something built into the formed character's natural expression rather than maintained against natural alternative inclinations. The private dimensions of the widowhood were more complicated than the preferred accounts organization around the resilience and the achievement allowed. The private dimensions were the dimensions whose honest examination requires the engagement with the specific quality of the widowhood's daily texture in the conditions of the primary context's removal, rather than with the public account's celebration of the approximation's production. The private dimensions include the drinking's consistent background across the decades of the widowhood, whose specific character this account has examined in the preceding section. The drinking was the consistent background of the daily texture in the conditions of the primary context's removal, and its consistent presence across the decades of the relevant period was the presence of something whose specific character was the character of the sustained response to the specific conditions of the widowhood's daily texture, rather than the charming eccentricity that the preferred account organized itself around presenting as the available account. The private dimensions include the financial trajectory, whose development across the decades of the widowhood this account has examined in the preceding section. The financial trajectory was the consistent expression of the primary organizational principle's operation in the financial dimension across the decades of the widowhood, producing the specific financial consequences that the trajectory expressed with the consistency of something built into the character rather than produced by the specific occasions. The private dimensions include the specific quality of the relationships with both daughters across the decades of the widowhood, whose honest examination the preceding section on the parenting has addressed, and whose specific development across the widowhood's 50 years produced the particular character of the relevant relationships that the Townsend situations management most acutely expressed. The Townsend situations management across 1953 to 1955 was the management of the primary context's removal's most significant single consequence for the relevant relationships across the widowhood's decades. The specific exercise of the social intelligence's primary instrument in the conditions of the most acute available conflict between the daughter's specific interests and the institutional management's assessment of the institutional interest, organized around the institutional conclusion rather than the honest provision of the available options that the daughter's specific interests required. The management served the institutional interest. The cost was Margaret's. The payment of the cost across the subsequent 5 decades of the Townsend decision's aftermath was the most sustained and the most directly documented evidence of what the widowhood's specific quality of the social intelligence's deployment in service of the institutional management's requirements produced in the specific person who bore the most direct consequences of the primary organizational principle's consistent operation. The widowhood produced the Queen Mother's most celebrated public persona, the gin and dubonnet, the hats, the wave from the carriage, the specific warmth of the public engagement with the relevant world across the 5 decades of the relevant position's management. The public persona was the persona of the gracious and beloved national grandmother, whose specific presence in the relevant occasions was the presence of someone whose social capability was the genuine expression of the formed character, and whose warmth was the genuine expression of the natural inclinations. The public persona was genuine in its specific dimensions. The private dimensions of the widowhood were more complicated than the persona allowed. The complication was the complication of the specific quality of the 50 years management of the primary context's removal, in the conditions of the most significant available personal loss's permanent presence in the daily texture of the relevant life, organized around the clearly understood priorities through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment, with the consistency of the natural expression rather than the managed performance. The natural expression produced the public persona. The natural expression also produced the private dimensions, whose honest examination the preceding sections of this account have assembled from the available evidence. Both the public persona and the private dimensions were the natural expression of the same formed character, whose primary organizational principle organized both in the conditions of the same relevant life across the 5 decades of the widowhood's specific duration. The widowhood lasted 50 years. The Queen Mother was 51 when it began. She was 101 when it ended. Across the 50 years, the widowhood's specific quality was the quality whose honest examination this section has produced from the available evidence. The public persona alongside the private dimensions, the resilience alongside the drinking, and the debt and the specific management of the relevant relationships through the primary organizational principles, consistent deployment in the conditions of the relevant circumstances. The 101 years produced the most successfully managed personal brand in 20th century British public life. The 50 years of the widowhood were the period of the brand's most complete and most sustained production. The private dimensions were the period's most consistently managed dimensions. The managing is what the brand required. The honest examination is what the brand was organized around preventing. The myth of the Queen Mother was the most successfully produced and the most durably sustained personal management operation in 20th century British public life, and its production, across a century of the relevant management's operation, was the production of something whose specific achievement was the achievement of replacing the person inside the myth with the myth itself in the public imagination so completely that the replacement became, across the decades of its sustained production, the primary available account of the relevant subject, rather than the managed selection from the full account that the honest examination of the available evidence produces. The myth's specific content was organized around three primary elements, whose combination gave the myth its specific durability and its specific resistance to the honest examination's displacement of the managed selection with the full account. The first element was the warmth, whose genuine quality made the myth's primary evidence genuinely authentic rather than simply the performed expression of the appropriate sentiment, giving the myth the specific foundation of genuine content that the purely performed myth cannot sustain across the relevant duration. The second element was the devotion to duty, whose genuine quality and the specific dimensions that the wartime conduct and the institutional engagement across the relevant decades, expressed with the consistency of something built into the formed character rather than maintained against natural alternative inclinations, gave the myth the specific additional foundation of genuine commitment that the durably sustained myth requires, alongside the genuine warmth. The third element was the love story. The George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon love story was the love story that the public account of the marriage organized itself around across the full span of the marriage's duration and the subsequent decades of the widowhood's management of the marriage's legacy. The devoted couple, the specific warmth of two people whose mutual support and mutual devotion organized the relevant shared life around the genuine partnership that the public account required the marriage to have been. Each of these elements had genuine content. The warmth was genuine. The commitment to the institutional demands was genuine, in the specific dimensions its expression reflected. The love story had the genuine dimension of Albert's genuine attraction to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's specific provision of the warmth and the social ease in the conditions where Albert's anxiety was most acute, whose genuine quality gave the love story the authentic foundation that the durably sustained myth requires. The genuine content was the myth's specific strength and the honest examination's specific challenge, because the genuine content gave the myth the specific resistance to the displacement that purely managed myths do not have, the resistance of something that can always point to the genuine dimensions as the evidence of the full account's accuracy, while the managed selections operation organizes the public account around those genuine dimensions in isolation from the more complicated private reality. The myth's costs were the costs that the managed selections operation imposed on the specific people whose lives the myth's production most directly shaped across the relevant decades of its sustained management. The costs were not the costs of the myth's genuine dimensions. The warmth's genuine expression did not impose the relevant costs. The commitment's genuine quality did not impose them. The love story's genuine content did not impose them. The costs were the costs of the managed selection's isolation of the genuine dimensions from the more complicated private reality, whose honest examination the myth's production was organized around preventing from becoming the available account of the relevant subject. George VI paid the myth's costs in the specific form of the sustained management of the stammer and the anxiety, and the specific health trajectory, whose development across the wartime years and the post-war period this account has examined, organized around the institutional demands, whose management in the conditions of the insufficient preparation was the sustained deployment of the available capabilities in the conditions of the most acute available national crises imposition on the relevant daily life. The myth's management of the relevant subject organized itself around the heroic narrative of someone who had overcome his limitations in service of the institutional duty, rather than around the honest account of the specific costs that the sustained deployment had imposed on the health trajectory, whose terminal phase was the February 1952 death at 56. The heroic narrative was not false in all its dimensions. The commitment was genuine. The courage in the specific conditions of the wartime period's most demanding occasions was genuine in the sense of being the genuine expression of the formed character's primary organizational principle, rather than the managed performance of the appropriate conduct. The myth organized itself around the genuine dimensions and managed the honest account of the costs into the background of the celebration of the genuine dimensions. The costs were real. The 56 years was the specific terminal expression of the costs' accumulation across the sustained deployment in the conditions of the most acute available demands. The honest account requires the costs alongside the genuine dimensions, rather than the genuine dimensions in isolation from the costs. Elizabeth paid the myth's costs in the specific form of the parenting whose specific character this account has examined. The parenting organized around the institutional management's primary organizational principle, rather than around the full provision of what the daughter's developmental requirements demanded of the primary parental relationship across the years of the relevant formation, and whose specific consequences for both daughters' formations were the formations that the subsequent decades of their adult lives expressed with the consistency of things built into the formation, rather than produced by the specific events of the specific occasions. Elizabeth's formation produced the Queen whose primary organizational principle was the institutional obligation's consistent priority, expressed in the management of the constitutional role across 70 years, with the consistency of something built into the formation. The building was the parenting's most significant contribution to the constitutional role's management across the relevant decades. Margaret paid the most acute and the most directly documented of the myth's costs, in the specific form of the Townsend decision and the 50 years of the aftermath's organization around the most significant available personal losses' permanent presence in the daily texture of the relevant life. The Townsend decision was the myth's most concentrated single expression in the conditions of the most acute available conflict between the daughter's specific interests and the institutional management's assessment of the institutional interest, organized around the institutional conclusion through the specific mechanisms of the Queen Mother's influence on the relevant relationships and the institutional management's consistent direction toward the conclusion that the October 1955 statement produced. The conclusion produced Margaret's life in the specific form, whose honest examination the preceding script in this series has assembled from the available evidence. The Armstrong-Jones marriage and its specific development across 18 years. The mystique world and its specific provision of the closest available approximation to the life the statement had formerly denied. The drinking and the health trajectory and the specific quality of the final decades, whose accumulation of the losses and their management was the most sustained and the most directly documented expression of what the myth's production had cost the person who bore the most direct consequences of the primary organizational principle's consistent operation in the conditions of the most acute available conflict between the daughter's specific interests and the institutional management's assessment of the institutional interest. The institution paid the myth's costs in the specific form of the management culture whose consistent operation in the service of the preferred account, rather than the honest engagement with the private reality, produced the specific institutional crises of the subsequent decades, whose most acute expressions were the Wales marriage and its management, the Diana situation and its aftermath, and the various specific institutional challenges whose honest examination the preceding scripts in this series have assembled from the available evidence. The management culture whose operation produced those crises was the management culture that the Queen Mother's myth's sustained production across the relevant decades had both reflected and reinforced. The specific institutional approach whose primary instrument was the managed selection's organization of public account around the preferred dimensions in isolation from the more complicated private reality, applied to the relevant subjects across the relevant decades, with the consistency of something built into the institutional culture, rather than produced by the specific decisions of the specific occasions. The built-in character of the management culture was the Queen Mother's myth's most significant institutional legacy, because the myth's production across a century of the relevant management's sustained operation had demonstrated the specific effectiveness of the managed selections approach, and had reinforced the institutional culture's deployment of that approach as the primary instrument for the management of the relevant subjects in the conditions of the relevant circumstances. The demonstration was the demonstration of the myth's specific durability, the century of sustained production, that the managed selection's consistent organization of the public account around the genuine dimensions in isolation from the more complicated private reality had achieved against the honest examination's consistent challenge. The durability demonstrated the managed selection's effectiveness as the primary instrument, and the demonstration reinforced the institutional culture's deployment of the instrument in the subsequent management of the relevant subjects. The reinforcement was the myth's most consequential contribution to the institutional management culture's specific character across the relevant decades, and the contribution's specific consequences were the consequences that the subsequent management of the relevant subjects expressed with the consistency of something built into the institutional culture rather than produced by the specific occasions. The myth lasted a century. The management that produced the myth lasted alongside it. The costs that the myth's production imposed on the specific people whose lives the myth's management most directly shaped were paid across the relevant decades with the consistency of the specific organizational principles' sustained operation in the conditions of the relevant circumstances. The organizational principle was the managed selection. The managed selection served the institutional interest. The institutional interest was the preferred accounts production and sustaining. The preferred accounts production required the management of the more complicated private reality into the background of the genuine dimensions celebration. The management produced the myth produced the brand replaced the person in the public imagination. The replacement was complete by the time of the death in 2002, when the tributes ran for days, and the gin and dubonnet, and the hats, and the wave from the carriage were the public account's primary evidence of who the relevant person had been. The honest account of who the relevant person had been is assembled here from the available evidence. The assembly produces the picture that the managed selection was organized across a century of sustained production to prevent from being the available account of the relevant subject. The picture is the picture of a woman of formidable intelligence and genuine warmth, whose primary organizational principle was the management of the relevant circumstances in the direction of the clearly understood priorities through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's deployment, applied across the full span of the relevant adult life, with the consistency of the natural expression rather than the managed performance, producing the genuine dimensions that the myth organized itself around, and the more complicated private reality that the myth was organized around, the preventing from becoming the available account. The genuine dimensions were the warmth and the commitment and the love story's authentic foundation. The more complicated private reality was the power dynamic, and the stammer's costs, and the abdication's transformation of the marriage's demands, and the wartime period's sustained deployment, and the parenting's specific character, and the drinking's consistent background, and the debt's sustained production, and the widowhood's 50 years of the primary context removals management. Both were Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, both were the Queen Mother, both are required for the honest portrait that the managed selection's century of sustained production was organized around preventing from being the available account of the relevant subject. The myth was the managed selection's product. The honest portrait is this account's product. The myth lasted a century. The honest portrait has been assembled here. The assembly is complete. The portrait is darker than the myth. The darkness is what the honest examination produces. The examination is what the myth was organized around preventing. The prevention held for a century. It ends here. The official account of George VI's private life is the account of the devoted husband whose primary personal relationship was the marriage to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon across the 28 years of the marriage's duration, organized around the mutual devotion and the genuine partnership that the public account of the marriage presented as the primary evidence of the relevant relationship's character. The official account is the account that the myth's sustained production organized itself around, and its organization around the devoted husband narrative was the organization that the managed selection's consistent deployment of the genuine dimensions in isolation from the more complicated private reality required. The more complicated private reality of George VI's private life is not documented in the available record with the specific precision that confident, detailed description would require for the honest account to produce the picture that the honest examination would ideally be able to produce from the available evidence. The limitation is the limitation of the institutional management's consistent application of the strategic silence to the relevant dimensions of the relevant subject across the full span of the relevant management's operation, which produced the specific absence of documentary evidence in the available record that the strategic silence's consistent application reliably produces in the subjects it is most consistently applied to. The strategic silence's consistent application to the relevant dimensions of George VI's private life was the application of the same primary instrument that the institutional management deployed across the management of every relevant subject, whose honest examination would have complicated the preferred account's production and sustaining. The instrument's application produced the absence. The absence is what the available record most directly documents in the relevant dimensions of the relevant subject, rather than the positive evidence of the specific private relationships that the honest examination would ideally be able to engage with in the direct terms of what the evidence supports. The limitation of the available evidence does not eliminate the honest examination's obligation to engage with what the available evidence does support in the relevant dimensions, because the limitation produced by the strategic silence's application is itself significant evidence of the institutional management's assessment of what the relevant dimensions contained and what the relevant dimensions required the strategic silence's protection from the honest examination's potential displacement of the preferred account. What the available evidence does support in the relevant dimensions is the picture assembled from the fragments that the strategic silence's consistent application was not able to eliminate entirely from the available record. The specific fragments of biographical testimony and historical account, whose independent examination produces a picture of George VI's private life, whose specific character was more complicated than the devoted husband narrative. The preferred account organized itself around presenting as the available account. The specific complications are documented in the relevant biographical accounts with varying degrees of directness, and the accounts whose examination produces the most honest available picture of the relevant complications are the accounts that engage with the specific fragments rather than organizing themselves around the preferred account's management of the relevant subject. Sarah Bradford's biography of George VI is the most directly honest of the major biographical accounts in its engagement with the specific dimensions of the marriage's private reality and the specific complications that the private reality expressed in the conditions of the relevant periods. Bradford's account draws on sources whose proximity to the relevant private dimensions of the marriage gives their accounts the specific authority of people who had observed the marriage in the conditions of its actual private reality, rather than in the conditions of the preferred account's presentation. Bradford's account describes the specific quality of the marriage's private reality in the relevant periods, with the honesty of someone whose examination of the available evidence had produced the picture of the marriage that the honest examination supports, rather than the picture the myth's preferred account had always been organized around producing. The picture includes the specific dimensions of the marriage's private reality, whose honest examination the preferred account was most organized around preventing from becoming the available account. The specific dimensions that Bradford's account addresses with the most direct available honesty are the dimensions of the marriage's emotional reality in the conditions of the stammer's consistent management and the abdication's transformation of the relevant institutional demands and the wartime period's sustained deployment of the available capabilities in the conditions of the most acute available national crisis. The emotional reality in those conditions was the reality of two people whose specific capabilities and specific formations had produced the power dynamic this account has examined, operating in the conditions of the most demanding available circumstances, with the specific consequences for both parties' emotional availability that the management's consistent requirements imposed. The emotional availability's specific reduction in the conditions of the management's consistent requirements was the reduction that the marriage's private reality expressed across the relevant periods. and the reduction's specific consequences for the relevant dimensions of the private relationship's texture were the consequences whose honest examination the Bradford biography addresses with more directness than the authorized accounts whose institutional cooperation required the management of the preferred account's maintenance alongside the honest examination's requirements. The specific complications that the emotional availability's reduction produced in the marriage's private reality are not documented in the available record with the precision that specific named relationships and specific documented occasions would provide, because the strategic silence's consistent application to the relevant dimensions was the application that the institutional management had organized around preventing exactly that precision from becoming the available record. The absence of the precision is the strategic silence's most direct documentary evidence. What is available is the picture assembled from the fragments, the accounts of people whose proximity to the relevant private dimensions gave them the observational access to the general character of the relevant complications, without the specific precision that the strategic silence's application was organized around preventing. The general character that the fragments produce is the character of someone whose emotional life, in the conditions of the management's consistent requirements and the relevant personal difficulties, was more complicated than the devoted husband narrative organized itself around presenting, expressed in the specific quality of the private relationships, whose existence the strategic silence's consistent application was the management of, rather than the elimination of. The management was the management of the myth's requirements. The myth required the devoted husband. The devoted husband required the strategic silence's consistent application to the relevant dimensions of the private life that the myth's preferred account was organized around not presenting as the available account. The strategic silence held across the full span of the relevant management's operation. The fragments that survived the holding are the fragments whose assembly produces the picture of a private life more complicated than the devoted husband narrative presented. The picture is the honest examination's product from the available evidence. The available evidence's limitation is the strategic silence's most significant legacy in the relevant dimensions of the relevant subject. The limitation is itself the honest account's most significant evidence of what the institutional management assessed the relevant dimensions as containing, and what the relevant dimensions required the strategic silence's consistent application to manage away from the available record. The myth required the devoted husband. The devoted husband required the strategic silence. The strategic silence required the absence. The absence is what the available record most directly documents. The honest examination acknowledges the absence and assembles from the fragments what the absence's management was organized around, preventing from being the available account. The assembled picture is more complicated than the devoted husband narrative. The complication is what the myth was organized around, preventing from being the available account. The honest account makes it available. The inside account of the George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon marriage is the account that the strategic silence's consistent application across the full span of the relevant management's operation was most organized around preventing from becoming the available account of the relevant subject, because the inside account is the account that the honest examination of the full picture requires, and that the myth's preferred account was most directly organized around preventing the available record from containing. The inside account is assembled here from the fragments that the strategic silence's application was not able to eliminate entirely from the available record. The specific accounts of people whose proximity to the private dimensions of the marriage's daily texture gave them the observational access to what the marriage actually was, rather than what the preferred account was organized around presenting it as being, whose independence from the institutional management's direct control gave their accounts the specific freedom from the managed selection's operation that the institutional management's directly controlled accounts did not have. Marion Crawford's account in The Little Princesses is the primary available inside account from someone whose proximity to the household across the relevant years gave her the specific observational access to the marriage's daily texture that the governess role in the royal household produced. Crawford's account was produced in the conditions of her dismissal from royal service following the publication, which gives the account the specific freedom from the institutional management's direct control that the dismissal's circumstances produced alongside the specific limitation of the institutional response's management of the account's reception, that the dismissal communicated to the relevant world about the appropriate engagement with the relevant account. Crawford's account of the household's daily texture describes the specific quality of the marriage's daily life in terms that the honest examination requires to be read against the full picture rather than against the warmth of the specific moments the account celebrates. The full picture that the honest reading produces is the picture of a household whose daily texture was organized around the management of the relevant institutional demands and the relevant personal difficulties in the specific conditions that the marriage's functional organization had established as the consistent background of the daily life. The consistent background was the background of George VI's stammer and anxiety, and the specific quality of his emotional availability in the private conditions of the household, rather than the public conditions of the relevant occasions. The stammer was the most visible dimension of the consistent background, but the stammer's visibility was the visibility of the most immediately observable expression of the specific combination of anxiety and withdrawal that the stammer's management in the conditions of the institutional demands produced in someone whose formation had not equipped him for the relevant demands, and whose management of those demands was the sustained deployment of the available capabilities in the conditions of the insufficient preparation. The withdrawal into the private conditions of the household was the specific response to the sustained deployment's demands in the conditions of the public occasions, and the quality of the withdrawal in the private conditions was the quality of someone whose emotional availability in those conditions was the emotional availability of someone managing the sustained deployment's aftermath, rather than the emotional availability of someone whose primary engagement was with the private conditions' specific dimensions. The management of the sustained deployment's aftermath in the private conditions of the household was the specific quality of the daily texture that Crawford's account observes and describes, with the specific directness of someone whose proximity to the relevant conditions gave her the observational access to the texture rather than simply to the public account's preferred presentation of the relevant subject. Elizabeth's management of the daily texture in those conditions was the management of someone whose specific capabilities were the primary resource for the management of the relevant circumstances in the conditions of the consistent background's operation. The management was genuine in the specific sense of being the natural expression of the formed character's primary instruments, rather than the managed performance against natural alternative inclinations, and its specific quality in the conditions of the daily texture was the quality of someone whose social intelligence and warmth were consistently deployed in the service of the management's requirements, alongside the management of the institutional demands that the relevant position organized around the relevant requirements. The specific quality of Elizabeth's management of the daily texture was the quality that Peter Townsend's account in Time and Chance describes with the specific directness of someone whose proximity to the household across the relevant years gave him the observational access to the marriage's daily texture, alongside the public account's preferred presentation of the relevant subject. Townsend describes the specific quality of Elizabeth's presence in the household in terms that the honest examination requires to be placed in the context of the full picture, rather than in the terms of the warmth that the relevant account celebrates in isolation from the more complicated dimensions of the relevant presence's specific character. The more complicated dimensions are the dimensions of the formidable intelligence's consistent deployment in the service of the clearly understood priorities through the specific instruments of the social intelligence's operation in the conditions of the daily texture's consistent management requirements. The deployment was genuine in the specific sense of being the natural expression rather than the managed performance, and its specific character in the conditions of the daily texture was the character that the full picture requires to be examined alongside the warmth, rather than in the isolation from the warmth that the preferred account's celebration of the warmth alone would require. The full picture of the marriage's daily texture from the inside is the picture assembled from the fragments of Crawford's account and Townsend's account, and the relevant biographical sources whose independent examination of the available evidence produces the same picture of a marriage whose daily texture was organized around the management of the relevant institutional demands and the relevant personal difficulties in the conditions of the specific power dynamic and the specific functional organization that this account has examined across the preceding sections. The picture is the picture of two people whose specific capabilities and specific formations had produced the marriage's functional organization as the primary context of the relevant shared life's management across the 28 years of the marriage's duration, expressed in the daily texture of the household, whose specific character the inside accounts describe, with the consistency of independent observations, producing the same picture of the relevant subject. The picture is more complicated than the devoted couple narrative's preferred account. The complication is the complication of the specific power dynamic and the specific functional organization whose honest examination the preceding sections have assembled from the available evidence. The inside account assembles the complication from the fragments. The fragments are the available evidence. The available evidence is what the strategic silence's consistent application left available from the full account whose production the strategic silence was organized around preventing. What remains after the strategic silence's consistent application is the inside account assembled from the fragments. The inside account is this one. The marriage was darker than the myth. The myth was brighter than the marriage. The myth lasted a century. The inside account has been assembled here. The assembly is complete. The marriage is what the honest examination of the available evidence produces from the fragments, the strategic silence left available. The fragments are the record. The record is what remains. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.